Chapter 15 of France and England in North America, Part 5. Count Frontenac, New France, Louis XIV, by Francis Parkman, Jr. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15 1691 to 1695. An interlude. While the Canadians hailed Frontenac as a father, he found also some recognition of his services from his masters at the court. The king wrote him a letter with his own hand to express satisfaction at the defense of Quebec, and sent him a gift of 2,000 crowns. He greatly needed the money, but prized the letter still more, and wrote to his relative, the minister Pontchartrain: "The gift you procured for me this year has helped me very much towards paying the great expenses which the crisis of our affairs and the excessive cost of living here have caused me. But though I receive this mark of His Majesty's goodness with the utmost respect and gratitude, I confess that I feel far more deeply the satisfaction that he has been pleased to express with my services. The raising of the siege of Quebec did not deserve all the attention that I hear he has given it in the midst of so many important events, and therefore I must needs ascribe it to your kindness in commending it to his notice. This leads me to hope that whenever some office, or permanent employment, or some mark of dignity or distinction may offer itself, you will put me on the list as well as others who have the honor to be as closely connected with you as I am; for it would be very hard to find myself forgotten because I am in a remote country, where it is more difficult and dangerous to serve the king than elsewhere. I have consumed all my property. Nothing is left but what the king gives me, and I have reached an age where, though neither strength nor goodwill fail me as yet, and though the latter will last as long as I live, I see myself on the eve of losing the former, so that a post a little more secure and tranquil than the government of Canada will suit my time of life; and if I can be assured of your support I shall not despair of getting such a one. Please then permit my wife and my friends to refresh your memory now and then on this point." Again, in the following year: "I have been encouraged to believe that the gift of 2,000 crowns, which His Majesty made me last year, would be continued, but apparently you have not been able to obtain it, for I think that you know the difficulty I have in living here on my salary. I hope that, when you find a better opportunity, you will try to procure me this favor. My only trust is in your support, and I am persuaded that, having the honor to be so closely connected with you, you would reproach yourself if you saw me sink into decrepitude without resources and without honors." And still again he appeals to the minister for "some permanent and honorable place attended with the marks of distinction which are more grateful than all the rest to a heart shaped after the right pattern." In return for these sturdy applications he got nothing for the present but a continuance of the king's gift of 2,000 crowns. Not every voice in the colony sounded the governor's praise. Now, as always, he had enemies in state and church. It is true that the quarrels and the bursts of passion that marked his first term of government now rarely occurred, but this was not so much due to a change in Frontenac himself as to a change in the conditions around him. The war made him indispensable. He had gained what he wanted, the consciousness of mastery, and under its soothing influence he was less irritable and exacting. He lived with the bishop on terms of mutual courtesy, while his relations with his colleague the intendant were commonly smooth enough on the surface, for Champigny, warned by the court not to offend him, treated him with studied deference, and was usually treated in return with urbane condescension. During all this time the intendant was complaining of him to the minister: "He is spending a great deal of money, but he is master, and does what he pleases. I can only keep the peace by yielding everything. He wants to reduce me to a nobody." And among other similar charges he says that the governor receives pay for garrisons that do not exist, and keeps it for himself. "Do not tell that I said so," adds the prudent Champigny, "for it would make great trouble if he knew it." Frontenac, perfectly aware of these covert attacks, desires the minister not to heed "the falsehoods and impostures uttered against me by persons who meddle with what does not concern them." He alludes to Champigny's allies, the Jesuits, who, as he thought, had also maligned him. "Since I have been here, I have spared no pains to gain the goodwill of Monsieur the Intendant, and may God grant that the counsels which he is too ready to receive from certain persons who have never been friends of peace and harmony, do not sometime make division between us. But I close my eyes to all that, and shall still persevere." In another letter to Pontchartrain he says: I write you this in private, because I have been informed by my wife that charges have been made to you against my conduct since my return to this country. I promise you, Monseigneur, that whatever my accusers do, they will not make me change conduct towards them, and that I shall still treat them with consideration. I merely ask your leave most humbly to represent that, having maintained this colony in full prosperity during the 10 years when I formerly held the government of it, I nevertheless fell a sacrifice to the artifice and fury of those whose encroachments, and whose excessive and unauthorized power, my duty and my passionate affection for the service of the King obliged me in conscience to repress. My recall, which made them masters in the conduct of the government, was followed by all the disasters which overwhelmed this unhappy colony. The millions that the King spent here, the troops that he sent out, and the Canadians that he took into pay, all went for nothing. Most of the soldiers, and no small number of brave Canadians, perished in enterprises ill devised and ruinous to the country, which I found on my arrival ravaged with unheard of cruelty by the Iroquois, without resistance, and in sight of the troops and of the forts. The inhabitants were discouraged and unnerved by want of confidence in their chiefs, while the friendly Indians, seeing our weakness, were ready to join our enemies. I was fortunate enough and diligent enough to change this deplorable state of things, and drive away the English, whom my predecessors did not have on their hands, and this too with only half as many troops as they had. I am far from wishing to blame their conduct. I leave you to judge it. But I cannot have the tranquillity and freedom of mind which I need for the work I have to do here, without feeling entire confidence that the cabal which is again forming against me cannot produce impressions which may prevent you from doing me justice. For the rest, if it is thought fit that I should leave the priests to do as they like, I shall be delivered from an infinity of troubles and cares, in which I can have no other interest than the good of the colony, the trade of the kingdom, and the peace of the King's subjects, and of which I alone bear the burden, as well as the jealousy of sundry persons, and the iniquity of the ecclesiastics, who begin to call impious those who are obliged to oppose their passions and their interests. As Champigny always sided with the Jesuits, his relations with Frontenac grew daily more critical. Open rupture at length seemed imminent, and the King interposed to keep the peace. "There has been discord between you under a show of harmony," he wrote to the disputants. Frontenac was exhorted to forbearance and calmness; while the Intendant was told that he allowed himself to be made an instrument of others, and that his charges against the Governor proved nothing but his own ill temper. The minister wrote in vain. The bickerings that he reproved were but premonitions of a greater strife. Bishop Saint Vallier was a rigid, austere, and contentious prelate, who loved power as much as Frontenac himself, and thought that, as the deputy of Christ, it was his duty to exercise it to the utmost. The Governor watched him with a jealous eye, well aware that, though the pretensions of the Church to supremacy over the civil power had suffered a check, Saint Vallier would revive them the moment he thought he could do so with success. I have shown elsewhere the severity of the ecclesiastical rule at Quebec, where the zealous pastors watched their flock with unrelenting vigilance, and associations of pious women helped them in the work. This naturally produced revolt, and tended to divide the town into two parties, the worldly and the devout. The love of pleasure was not extinguished, and various influences helped to keep it alive. Perhaps none of these was so potent as the presence in winter of a considerable number of officers from France, whose piety was often less conspicuous than their love of enjoyment. At the Château St. Louis, a circle of young men, more or less brilliant and accomplished, surrounded the Governor and formed a centre of social attraction. Frontenac was not without religion, and he held it becoming a man of his station not to fail in its observances; but he would not have a Jesuit confessor, and placed his conscience in the keeping of the Récollet friars, who were not politically aggressive, and who had been sent to Canada expressly as a foil to the rival order. They found no favor in the eyes of the Bishop and his adherents, and the Governor found none for the support he lent them. The winter that followed the arrival of the furs from the upper lakes was a season of gaiety without precedent since the war began. All was harmony at Quebec till the Carnival approached, when Frontenac, whose youthful instincts survived his 74 years, introduced a startling novelty which proved the signal of discord. One of his military circle, the sharp-witted Lamotte Cadillac, thus relates this untoward event in a letter to a friend. "The winter passed very pleasantly, especially to the officers, who lived together like comrades. And to contribute to their honest enjoyment, the Count caused two plays to be acted, Nicomede and Mithridate. It was an amateur performance in which the officers took part along with some of the ladies of Quebec. The success was prodigious, and so was the storm that followed. Half a century before, the Jesuits had grieved over the first ball in Canada. Private theatricals were still more baneful. The clergy, continues Lamotte, beat their alarm drums, armed cap a pie, and snatched their bows and arrows. The Sieur Glandelet was first to begin, and preached 2 sermons, in which he tried to prove that nobody could go to a play without mortal sin. The bishop issued a mandate, and had it read from the pulpits, in which he speaks of certain impious, impure, and noxious comedies, insinuating that those which had been acted were such. The credulous and infatuated people, seduced by the sermons and the mandate, began already to regard the Count as a corrupter of morals and a destroyer of religion. The numerous party of the pretended devotees mustered in the streets and public places, and presently made their way into the houses, to confirm the weak-minded in their illusion, and tried to make the stronger share it. But as they failed in this almost completely, they resolved at last to conquer or die, and persuaded the bishop to use a strange device, which was to publish a mandate in the church, whereby the Sieur de Mareuil, a half-pay lieutenant, was interdicted the use of the sacraments. This story needs explanation. Not only had the amateur actors at the chateau played 2 pieces inoffensive enough in themselves, but a report had been spread that they meant next to perform the famous Tartuffe of Moliere, a satire which, while purporting to be levelled against falsehood, lust, greed, and ambition, covered with a mask of religion, was rightly thought by a portion of the clergy to be levelled against themselves. The friends of Frontenac say that the report was a hoax. Be this as it may, the bishop believed it. This worthy prelate, continues the irreverent Lamotte, was afraid of Tartuffe, and had got it into his head that the Count meant to have it played, though he had never thought of such a thing. Monsieur de Saint Vallier sweated blood and water to stop a torrent which existed only in his imagination. It was now that he launched his 2 mandates, both on the same day, one denouncing comedies in general, and Tartuffe in particular, and the other smiting Mareuil, who says, uses language capable of making heaven blush, and whom he elsewhere stigmatizes as worse than a Protestant. It was Mareuil who, as reported, was to play the part of Tartuffe, and on him, therefore, the brunt of episcopal indignation fell. He was not a wholly exemplary person. I mean, says Lamotte, to show you the truth in all its nakedness. The fact is that about 2 years ago, when the Sieur de Mareuil first came to Canada, and was carousing with his friends, he sang some indecent song or other. The Count was told of it, and gave him a severe reprimand. This is the charge against him. After a 2 years' silence, the pastoral zeal has wakened, because a play is to be acted which the clergy mean to stop at any cost. The bishop found another way of stopping it. He met Frontenac with the intendant near the Jesuit chapel, accosted him on the subject which filled his thoughts, and offered him 100 pistoles if he would prevent the playing of Tartuffe. Frontenac laughed and closed the bargain. Saint Vallier wrote his note on the spot, and the governor took it, apparently well pleased to have made the bishop disburse. I thought, writes the intendant, that Monsieur de Frontenac would have given him back the paper. He did no such thing, but drew the money on the next day and gave it to the hospitals. Mareuil, deprived of the sacraments and held up to reprobation, went to see the bishop, who refused to receive him, and it is said that he was taken by the shoulders and put out of doors. He now resolved to bring his case before the council, but the bishop was informed of his purpose and anticipated it. Lamotte says, he went before the council on the 1st of February, and denounced the Sieur de Mareuil, whom he declared guilty of impiety towards God, the Virgin, and the saints, and made a fine speech in the absence of the Count, interrupted by the effusions of a heart which seemed filled with a profound and infinite charity, but which, as he said, was pushed to extremity by the rebellion of an indocile child, who had neglected all his warnings. This was, nevertheless, assumed, I will not say entirely false. The bishop did, in fact, make a vehement speech against Mareuil before the council on the day in question; Mareuil stoutly defending himself and entering his appeal against the episcopal mandate. The battle was now fairly joined. Frontenac stood alone for the accused. The Intendant tacitly favored his opponents. Auteuil, the Attorney General, and Villeray, the first councillor, owed the governor an old grudge, and they and their colleagues sided with the bishop with the outside support of all the clergy except the Récollets, who as usual ranged themselves with their patron. At first Frontenac showed great moderation, but grew vehement and then violent as the dispute proceeded, as did also the Attorney General, who seems to have done his best to exasperate him. Frontenac affirmed that in depriving Mareuil and others of the sacraments, with no proof of guilt and no previous warning, and on allegations which, even if true, could not justify the act, the bishop exceeded his powers, and trenched on those of the King. The point was delicate. The Attorney General avoided the issue, tried to raise others, and revived the old quarrel about Frontenac's place in the Council, which had been settled 14 years before. Other questions were brought up and angrily debated. The governor demanded that the debates, along with the papers which introduced them, should be entered on the record, that the King might be informed of everything; but the demand was refused. The discords of the council chambers spread into the town. Quebec was divided against itself. Mareuil insulted the bishop, and some of his scapegrace sympathizers broke the prelate's windows at night and smashed his chamber door. Mareuil was at last ordered to prison, and the whole affair was referred to the King. These proceedings consumed the spring, the summer, and a part of the autumn. Meanwhile an access of zeal appeared to seize the bishop, and he launched interdictions to the right and left. Even Champigny was startled when he refused the sacraments to all but 4 or 5 of the military officers for alleged tampering with the pay of their soldiers, a matter wholly within the province of the temporal authorities. During a recess of the council, he set out on a pastoral tour, and arriving at 3 Rivers, excommunicated an officer named Desjardins for a reputed intrigue with the wife of another officer. He next repaired to Sorel, and being there on a Sunday, was told that 2 officers had neglected to go to mass. He wrote to Frontenac, complaining of the offense. Frontenac sent for the culprits and rebuked them, but retracted his words when they proved by several witnesses that they had been duly present at the rite. The bishop then went up to Montreal, and discord went with him. Except Frontenac alone, Callière, the local governor, was the man in all Canada to whom the country owed most; but, like his chief, he was a friend of the Récollets, and this did not commend him to the bishop. The friars were about to receive 2 novices into their order, and they invited the bishop to officiate at the ceremony. Callière was also present, kneeling at a prie-dieu, or prayer desk, near the middle of the church. Saint Vallier, having just said mass, was seating himself in his armchair, close to the altar, when he saw Callière at the prie-dieu, with the position of which he had already found fault as being too honorable for a subordinate governor. He now rose, approached the object of his disapproval, and said, "Monsieur, you are taking a place which belongs only to Monsieur de Frontenac." Callière replied that the place was that which properly belonged to him. The bishop rejoined that, if he did not leave it, he himself would leave the church. "You can do as you please," said Callière; and the prelate withdrew abruptly through the sacristy, refusing any farther part in the ceremony. When the services were over, he ordered the friars to remove the obnoxious prie-dieu. They obeyed, but an officer of Callière replaced it, and unwilling to offend him, they allowed it to remain. On this the bishop laid their church under an interdict, that is, he closed it against the celebration of all the rites of religion. He then issued a pastoral mandate, in which he charged Father Joseph Denis, their superior, with offences which he dared not name for fear of making the paper blush. His tongue was less bashful than his pen, and he gave out publicly that the Father Superior had acted as go-between in an intrigue of his sister with the Chevalier de Callière. It is said that the accusation was groundless, and the character of the woman wholly irreproachable. The Récollets submitted for 2 months to the bishop's interdict, then refused to obey longer, and opened their church again. Quebec, 3 Rivers, Sorel, and Montreal had all been ruffled by the breeze of these dissensions, and the farthest outposts of the wilderness were not too remote to feel it. Lamotte Cadillac had been sent to replace Louvigny in the command of Michilimackinac, where he had scarcely arrived when trouble fell upon him. "Poor Monsieur de Lamotte Cadillac," says Frontenac, would have sent you a journal to show you the persecutions he has suffered at the post where I placed him, and where he does wonders, having great influence over the Indians, who both love and fear him, but he has no time to copy it. Means have been found to excite against him 3 or 4 officers of the posts dependent on his, who have put upon him such a strange and unheard of affronts, that I was obliged to send them to prison when they came down to the colony. A certain Father Careil, the Jesuit who wrote me such insolent letters a few years ago, has played an amazing part in this affair. I shall write about it to Father Lachaise, that he may set it right. Some remedy must be found; for if it continues, none of the officers who were sent to Michilimackinac, the Miamis, the Illinois, and other places, can stay there on account of the persecutions to which they are subjected, and the refusal of absolution as soon as they fail to do what is wanted of them. Joined to all this is a shameful traffic in influence and money. Monsieur de Tonty could have written to you about it, if he had not been obliged to go off to the Assiniboines to rid himself of all these torments. In fact, there was a chronic dispute at the forest outposts between the officers and the Jesuits, concerning which matter much might be said on both sides. The Bishop sailed for France. "He has gone," writes Callieres, "after quarrelling with everybody." The various points in dispute were set before the King. An avalanche of memorials, letters, and procès-verbaux descended upon the unfortunate monarch, some concerning Mareuil and the quarrels in the Council, others on the excommunication of Desjardins, and others on the troubles at Montreal. They were all referred to the King's Privy Council. An adjustment was effected; order, if not harmony, was restored, and the usual distribution of advice, exhortation, reproof, and menace was made to the parties in the strife. Frontenac was commended for defending the royal prerogative, censured for violence, and admonished to avoid future quarrels. Champigny was reproved for not supporting the governor, and told that "His Majesty sees with great pain that, while he is making extraordinary efforts to sustain Canada at a time so critical, all his cares and all his outlays are made useless by your misunderstanding with Monsieur de Frontenac." The Attorney General was sharply reprimanded, told that he must mend his ways or lose his place, and ordered to make an apology to the governor. Villeray was not honored by a letter, but the Intendant was directed to tell him that his behavior had greatly displeased the King. Callieres was mildly advised not to take part in the disputes of the Bishop and the Récollets. Thus was conjured down one of the most bitter as well as the most needless, trivial, and untimely of the quarrels that enliven the annals of New France. A generation later, when its incidents had faded from memory, a passionate and reckless partisan, Abbé Latour, published, and probably invented, a story which later writers have copied till it now forms an accepted episode of Canadian history. According to him, Frontenac, in order to ridicule the clergy, formed an amateur company of comedians expressly to play Tartuffe; and after rehearsing at the Château during 3 or 4 months, they acted the piece before a large audience. He was not satisfied with having it played at the Château, but wanted the actors and actresses and the dancers, male and female, to go in full costume, with violins, to play it in all the religious communities except the Récollets. He took them first to the house of the Jesuits, where the crowd entered with him; then to the hospital, to the Hall of the Paupers, whither the nuns were ordered to repair; then he went to the Ursuline convent, assembled the sisterhood, and had the piece played before them. To crown the insult, he wanted next to go to the seminary and repeat the spectacle there; but warning having been given, he was met on the way and begged to refrain. He dared not persist, and withdrew in very ill humor. Not one of the numerous contemporary papers, both official and private, and written in great part by enemies of Frontenac, contains the slightest allusion to any such story, and many of them are wholly inconsistent with it. It may safely be set down as a fabrication to blacken the memory of the governor, and exhibit the bishop and his adherents as victims of persecution. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of France and England in North America, Part 5, Count Frontenac, New France, Louis XIV, by Francis Parkman, Jr. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16, 1690 to 1694. The War in Acadia. Amid domestic strife, the war with England and the Iroquois still went on. The contest for territorial mastery was fourfold: first, for the control of the West; secondly, for that of Hudson's Bay; thirdly, for that of Newfoundland; and lastly, for that of Acadia. All these vast and widely sundered regions were included in the government of Frontenac. Each division of the war was distinct from the rest, and each had a character of its own. As the contest for the West was wholly with New York and her Iroquois allies, so the contest for Acadia was wholly with the Bostonnais, or people of New England. Acadia, as the French at this time understood the name, included Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and the greater part of Maine. Sometimes they placed its western boundary at the little river St. Georges, and sometimes at the Kennebec. Since the wars of D'Aulnay and La Tour, this wilderness had been a scene of unceasing strife; for the English drew their eastern boundary at the St. Croix, and the claims of the rival nationalities overlapped each other. In the time of Cromwell, Sedgwick, a New England officer, had seized the whole country. The peace of Breda restored it to France; the Chevalier de Grandfontaine was ordered to reoccupy it, and the King sent out a few soldiers, a few settlers, and a few women as their wives. Grandfontaine held the nominal command for a time, followed by a succession of military chiefs, Chambly, Marson, and Lavalliere. Then Perrault, whose malpractices had cost him the government of Montreal, was made governor of Acadia; and as he did not mend his ways, he was replaced by Meneval. One might have sailed for days along these lonely coasts and seen no human form. At Canseau, or Charabucto, at the eastern end of Nova Scotia, there was a fishing station and a fort. Chibucto, now Halifax, was a solitude. At La Heve there were a few fishermen, and thence, as you doubled the rocks of the Cap Sable, the ancient haunt of La Tour, you would have seen 4 French settlers and an unlimited number of seals and seafowl. Ranging the shore by St. Mary's Bay, and entering the Strait of Annapolis Basin, you would have found the fort of Port Royal, the chief place of all Acadia. It stood at the head of the basin, where De Monts had planted his settlement nearly a century before. Around the fort and along the neighboring river were about 95 small houses; and at the head of the Bay of Fundy were 2 other settlements, Beaubassin and La Mine, comparatively stable and populous. At the mouth of the St. John were the abandoned ruins of La Tour's old fort; and on a spot less exposed, at some distance up the river, stood the small wooden fort of Jemsek, with a few intervening clearings. Still sailing westward, passing Mount Desert, another scene of ancient settlement, and entering Penobscot Bay, you would have found the Baron de St. Castin with his Indian harem at Pentejet, where the town of Castine now stands. All Acadia was comprised in these various stations, more or less permanent, together with 1 or 2 small posts on the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and the huts of an errant population of fishermen and fur traders. In the time of Denonville the colonists numbered less than 1,000 souls. The King, busied with nursing Canada, had neglected its less important dependency. Rude as it was, Acadia had charms, and has them still; in its wilderness of woods and its wilderness of waves; the rocky ramparts that guard its coasts; its deep, still bays and foaming headlands; the towering cliffs of the Grand Menan; the innumerable islands that cluster about Penobscot Bay; and the romantic highlands of Mount Desert, down whose gorges the sea fog rolls like an invading host, while the spires of fir trees pierce the surging vapors like lances in the smoke of battle. Leaving Pentejet and sailing westward all day along a solitude of woods, one might reach the English outpost of Pemaquid, and thence, still sailing on, might anchor at evening off Casco Bay, and see in the glowing west the distant peak of the White Mountains, spectral and dim amid the weird and fiery sunset. Inland Acadia was all forest, and vast tracts of it are a primeval forest still. Here roamed the Abenakis with their kindred tribes, a race wild as their haunts. In habits they were all much alike. Their villages were on the waters of the Androscoggin, the Saco, the Kennebec, the Penobscot, the St. Croix, and the St. John. Here in spring they planted their corn, beans, and pumpkins, and then, leaving them to grow, went down to the sea in their birch canoes. They returned towards the end of the summer, gathered their harvest, and went again to the sea, where they lived in abundance on ducks, geese, and other waterfowl. During winter most of the women, children, and old men remained in the villages; while the hunters ranged the forest in chase of moose, deer, caribou, beavers, and bears. Their summer stay at the seashore was perhaps the most pleasant, and certainly the most picturesque, part of their lives. Bivouacked by some of the innumerable coves and inlets that indent these coasts, they passed their days in that alternation of indolence and action which is a second nature to the Indian. Here, in wet weather, while the torpid water was dimpled with raindrops, and the upturned canoes lay idle on the pebbles, the listless warrior smoked his pipe under his roof of bark, or launched his slender craft at the dawn of the July day, when shores and islands were painted in shadow against the rosy east, and forests, dusky and cool, lay waiting for the sunrise. The women gathered raspberries or whortleberries in the open places of the woods, or clams and oysters in the sands and shallows, adding their shells as a contribution to the shell heaps that have accumulated for ages along these shores. The men fished, speared porpoises, or shot seals. A priest was often in the camp watching over his flock, and saying mass every day in a chapel of bark. There was no lack of altar candles, made by mixing tallow with the wax of the bayberry, which abounded among the rocky hills, and was gathered in profusion by the squaws and children. The Abenaki missions were a complete success. Not only those of the tribe who had been induced to migrate to the mission villages of Canada, but also those who remained in their native woods, were, or were soon to become, converts to Romanism, and therefore allies of France. Though less ferocious than the Iroquois, they were brave, after the Indian manner, and they rarely or never practiced cannibalism. Some of the French were as lawless as their Indian friends. Nothing is more strange than the incongruous mixture of the forms of feudalism with the independence of the Acadian woods. Vast grants of land were made to various persons, some of whom are charged with using them for no other purpose than roaming over their domains with Indian women. The only settled agricultural population was at Port Royal, Beaubassin, and the basin of Minas. The rest were fishermen, fur traders, or rovers of the forest. Repeated orders came from the court to open a communication with Quebec, and even to establish a line of military posts through the intervening wilderness, but the distance and the natural difficulties of the country proved insurmountable obstacles. If communication with Quebec was difficult, that with Boston was easy. And thus Acadia became largely dependent on its New England neighbors, who, says an Acadian officer, are mostly fugitives from England, guilty of the death of their late king, and accused of conspiracy against their present sovereign. Others of them are pirates, and they are all united in a sort of independent republic. Their relations with the Acadians were of a mixed sort. They continually encroached on Acadian fishing grounds, and we hear at one time of 100 of their vessels thus engaged. This was not all. The interlopers often landed and traded with the Indians along the coast. Meneval, the governor, complained bitterly of their arrogance. Sometimes, it is said, they pretended to be foreign pirates, and plundered vessels and settlements, while the aggrieved parties could get no redress at Boston. They also carried on a regular trade at Port Royal and Les Mines or Grand Pre, where many of the inhabitants regarded them with a degree of favor which gave great umbrage to the military authorities, who nevertheless are themselves accused of seeking their own profit by dealings with the heretics. And even French priests, including Petit, the Curé of Port Royal, are charged with carrying on this illicit trade in their own behalf, and in that of a seminary of Quebec. The settlers caught from the Bostonnais what their governor stigmatizes as English and parliamentary ideas, the chief effect of which was to make them restive under his rule. The Church, moreover, was less successful in excluding heresy from Acadia than from Canada. A number of Huguenots established themselves at Port Royal, and formed sympathetic relations with the Boston Puritans. The bishop at Quebec was much alarmed. "This is dangerous," he writes. "I pray your Majesty to put an end to these disorders." A sort of chronic warfare of aggression and reprisal, closely akin to piracy, was carried on at intervals in Acadian waters by French private armed vessels on one hand, and New England private armed vessels on the other. Genuine pirates also frequently appeared. They were of various nationality, though usually buccaneers from the West Indies. They preyed on New England trading and fishing craft, and sometimes attacked French settlements. One of their most notorious exploits was the capture of 2 French vessels and a French fort at Chalabucto by a pirate manned in part, it is said, from Massachusetts. A similar proceeding of earlier date was the act of Dutchmen from St. Domingo. They made a descent on the French port of Pentejet on Penobscot Bay. Chambly, then commanding for the king in Acadia, was in the place. They assaulted his works, wounded him, took him prisoner, and carried him to Boston, where they held him at ransom. His young ensign escaped into the woods, and carried the news to Canada, but many months elapsed before Chambly was released. This young ensign was Jean Vincent de Labadie, Baron de Saint Castin, a native of Béarn on the slopes of the Pyrenees, the same rough, strong soil that gave to France her Henry IV. When 15 years of age, he came to Canada with the regiment of Carignan-Salière, ensign in the company of Chambly; and when the regiment was disbanded, he followed his natural bent, and betook himself to the Acadian woods. At this time there was a square bastioned fort at Pentejet, mounted with 12 small cannon; but after the Dutch attack it fell into decay. Saint Castin, meanwhile, roamed the woods with the Indians, lived like them, formed connections more or less permanent with their women, became himself a chief, and gained such ascendancy over his red associates that, according to La Hontan, they looked upon him as their tutelary god. He was bold, hardy, adroit, tenacious; and, in spite of his erratic habits, had such capacity for business that, if we may believe the same somewhat doubtful authority, he made a fortune of 300,000 or 400,000 crowns. His gains came chiefly through his neighbors of New England, whom he hated, but to whom he sold his beaver skins at an ample profit. His trading house was at Pentejet, now called Castine, in or near the old fort; a perilous spot, which he occupied or abandoned by turns, according to the needs of the time. Being a devout Catholic, he wished to add a resident priest to his establishment for the conversion of his Indian friends, but, observes Father Petit of Port Royal, who knew him well, "He himself has need of spiritual aid to sustain him in the paths of virtue." He usually made 2 visits a year to Port Royal, where he gave liberal gifts to the church of which he was the chief patron, attended mass with exemplary devotion, and then, shriven of his sins, returned to his squaws at Pentejet. Perrault, the governor, maligned him; the motive, as Saint Castin says, being jealousy of his success in trade, for Perrault himself traded largely with the English and the Indians. This, indeed, seems to have been his chief occupation, and as Saint Castin was his principal rival, they were never on good terms. Saint Castin complained to Denonville. "Monsieur Petit," he writes, "will tell you everything. I will only say that he (Perrault) kept me under arrest from the 21st of April to the 9th of June, on pretence of a little weakness I had for some women, and even told me that he had your orders to do it; but that is not what troubles him; and as I do not believe there is another man under heaven who will do meaner things through love of gain, even to selling brandy by the pint and half pint before strangers in his own house, because he does not trust a single one of his servants, I see plainly what is the matter with him. He wants to be the only merchant in Acadia." Perrault was recalled this very year, and his successor, Meneval, received instructions in regard to Saint Castin, which show that the king or his minister had a clear idea both of the Baron's merits and of his failings. The new governor was ordered to require him to abandon "his vagabond life among the Indians, cease all trade with the English, and establish a permanent settlement." Meneval was farther directed to assure him that, if he conformed to the royal will, and led a life "more becoming a gentleman," he might expect to receive proofs of his Majesty's approval. In the next year Meneval reported that he had represented to Saint Castin the necessity of reform, and that in consequence he had abandoned his trade with the English, given up his squaws, married, and promised to try to make a solid settlement. True, he had reformed before, and might need to reform again, but his faults were not of the baser sort; he held his honor high, and was free-handed as he was bold. His wife was what the early chroniclers would call an Indian princess, for she was the daughter of Madakawando, chief of the Penobscots. So critical was the position of his post at Pentejet that a strong fort and a sufficient garrison could alone hope to maintain it against the pirates and the Bostonnais. Its vicissitudes had been many. Standing on ground claimed by the English, within territory which had been granted to the Duke of York, and which on his accession to the throne became a part of the royal domain, it was never safe from attack. In 1686 it was plundered by an agent of Dungan. In 1687 it was plundered again; and in the next year Andros, then royal governor, anchored before it in his frigate, the Rose, landed with his attendants, and stripped the building of all it contained, except a small altar with pictures and ornaments, which they found in the principal room. Saint Castin escaped to the woods, and Andros sent him word by an Indian that his property would be carried to Pemaquid, and that he would have it again by becoming a British subject. He refused the offer. The rival English post of Pemaquid was destroyed, as we have seen, by the Abenakis in 1689, and in the following year they and their French allies had made such havoc among the border settlements that nothing was left east of the Piscataqua except the villages of Wells, York, and Kittery. But a change had taken place in the temper of the savages, mainly due to the easy conquest of Port Royal by Phipps, and to an expedition of the noted partisan church by which they had suffered considerable losses. Fear of the English on one hand, and the attraction of their trade on the other, disposed many of them to peace. 6 chiefs signed a truce with the commissioners of Massachusetts, and promised to meet them in council to bury the hatchet for ever. The French were filled with alarm. Peace between the Abenakis and the Bostonnais would be disastrous both to Acadia and to Canada, because these tribes held the passes through the northern wilderness, and so long as they were in the interest of France, covered the settlements on the St. Lawrence from attack. Moreover, the government relied on them to fight its battles. Therefore no pains were spared to break off their incipient treaty with the English and spur them again to war. Villebon, a Canadian of good birth, one of the brothers of Portneuf, was sent by the King to govern Acadia. Presents for the Abenakis were given him in abundance, and he was ordered to assure them of support so long as they fought for France. He and his officers were told to join their war parties, while the Canadians who followed him to Acadia were required to leave all other employments and wage incessant war against the English borders. "You yourself," says the minister, "will herein set them so good an example that they will be animated by no other desire than that of making profit out of the enemy. There is nothing which I more strongly urge upon you than to put forth all your ability and prudence to prevent the Abenakis from occupying themselves in anything but war, and by good management of the supplies which you have received for their use to enable them to live by it more to their advantage than by hunting." Armed with these instructions, Villebon repaired to his post, where he was joined by a body of Canadians under Portneuf. His first step was to reoccupy Port Royal, and as there was nobody there to oppose him, he easily succeeded. The settlers renounced allegiance to Massachusetts and King William, and swore fidelity to their natural sovereign. The capital of Acadia dropped back quietly into the lap of France. But as the Bostonnais might recapture it at any time, Villebon crossed to the St. John and built a fort high up the stream of Naxwat, opposite the present city of Fredericton. Here no Bostonnais could reach him, and he could muster war parties at his leisure. One thing was indispensable. A blow must be struck that would encourage and excite the Abenakis. Some of them had no part in the truce, and were still so keen for English blood that a deputation of their chiefs told Frontenac at Quebec that they would fight, even if they must head their arrows with the bones of beasts. They were under no such necessity. Guns, powder, and lead were given them in abundance, and Thury, the priest on the Penobscot, urged them to strike the English. 150 of his converts took the war path, and were joined by a band from the Kennebec. It was January, and they made their way on snowshoes along the frozen streams and through the deathly solitudes of the winter forest, till, after marching a month, they neared their destination, the frontier settlement of York. In the afternoon of the 4th of February they encamped at the foot of a high hill, evidently Mount Agamenticus, from the top of which the English village lay in sight. It was a collection of scattered houses along the banks of the river Agamenticus and the shore of the adjacent sea. 5 or more of them were built for defense, though owned and occupied by families like the other houses. Near the sea stood the unprotected house of the chief man of the place, Dummer, the minister. York appears to have contained from 300 to 400 persons of all ages, for the most part rude and ignorant borderers. The warriors lay shivering all night in the forest, not daring to make fires. In the morning a heavy fall of snow began. They moved forward and soon heard the sound of an axe. It was an English boy chopping wood. They caught him, extorted such information as they needed, then tomahawked him and moved on, till, hidden by the forest and the thick snow, they reached the outskirts of the village. Here they divided into 2 parties, and each took its station. A gun was fired as a signal, upon which they all yelled the war whoop, and dashed upon their prey. One party mastered the nearest fortified house, which had scarcely a defender but women. The rest burst into the unprotected houses, killing or capturing the astonished inmates. The minister was at his door, in the act of mounting his horse to visit some distant parishioners, when a bullet struck him dead. He was a graduate of Harvard College, a man advanced in life, of some learning, and greatly respected. The French accounts say that about 100 persons, including women and children, were killed, and about 80 captured. Those who could ran for the fortified houses of Preble, Harmon, Alcock, and Norton, which were soon filled with the refugees. The Indians did not attack them, but kept well out of gunshot, and busied themselves in pillaging, killing horses and cattle, and burning the unprotected houses. They then divided themselves into small bands, and destroyed all the outlying farms for 4 or 5 miles around. The wish of King Louis was fulfilled. A good profit had been made out of the enemy. The victors withdrew into the forest with their plunder and their prisoners, among whom were several old women and a number of children from 3 to 7 years old. These, with a forbearance which does them credit, they permitted to return uninjured to the nearest fortified house, in requital, it is said, for the lives of a number of Indian children spared by the English in a recent attack on the Androscoggin. The wife of the minister was allowed to go with them, but her son remained a prisoner, and the agonized mother went back to the Indian camp to beg for his release. They again permitted her to return, but when she came a second time they told her that, as she wanted to be a prisoner, she should have her wish. She was carried with the rest to their village, where she soon died of exhaustion and distress. One of the warriors arrayed himself in the gown of the slain minister, and preached a mock sermon to the captive parishioners. Leaving York in ashes, the victors began their march homeward, while a body of men from Portsmouth followed on their trail, but soon lost it, and failed to overtake them. There was a season of feasting and scalp dancing at the Abenaki towns, and then as spring opened 100 of the warriors set out to visit Villebon, tell him of their triumph, and receive the promised gifts from their great father the king. Villebon and his brothers, Portneuf, Neuvillette, and Desilles, with their Canadian followers, had spent the winter chiefly on the St. John, finishing their fort at Naxuat, and preparing for future operations. The Abenaki visitors arrived towards the end of April, and were received with all possible distinction. There were speeches, gifts, and feasting, for they had done much, and were expected to do more. Portneuf sang a war song in their language; then he opened a barrel of wine. The guests emptied it in less than 15 minutes, sang, whooped, danced, and promised to repair to the rendezvous of St. Castin's station of Pentejet. A grand war party was afoot, and a new and withering blow was to be struck against the English border. The guests set out for Pentejet, followed by Portneuf, Desilles, La Brognerie, several other officers, and 20 Canadians. A few days after, a large band of Micmacs arrived. Then came the Malecite warriors from their village of Medactic, and at last Father Baudouin appeared, leading another band of Micmacs from his mission of Beaubassin. Speeches, feasts, and gifts were made to them all, and they all followed the rest to the appointed rendezvous. At the beginning of June, the site of the town of Castine was covered with wigwams and the beach lined with canoes. Malecites and Micmacs, Abenakis from the Penobscot, and Abenakis from the Kennebec were here, some 400 warriors in all. Here, too, were Portneuf and his Canadians, the Baron de St. Castin and his Indian father-in-law, Madocawando, with Moxus, Ejaramet, and other noted chiefs, the terror of the English borders. They crossed Penobscot Bay, and marched upon the frontier village of Wells. Wells, like York, was a small settlement of scattered houses along the seashore. The year before, Moxus had vainly attacked it with 200 warriors. All the neighboring country had been laid waste by a murderous war of detail, the lonely farmhouses pillaged and burned, and the survivors driven back to refuge to the older settlements. Wells had been crowded with these refugees, but famine and misery had driven most of them beyond the Piscataqua, and the place was now occupied by a remnant of its own destitute inhabitants, who, warned by the fate of York, had taken refuge in 5 fortified houses. The largest of these, belonging to Joseph Storer, was surrounded by a palisade, and occupied by 15 armed men under Captain Converse, an officer of militia. On the 9th of June, 2 sloops and a sailboat ran up the neighboring creek, bringing supplies and 14 more men. The succor came in the nick of time. The sloops had scarcely anchored when a number of cattle were seen running frightened and wounded from the woods. It was plain that the enemy was lurking there. All the families of the place now gathered within the palisades of Storer's house, thus increasing his force to about 30 men, and a close watch was kept throughout the night. In the morning no room was left for doubt. One John Diamond, on his way from the house to the sloops, was seized by Indians and dragged off by the hair. Then the whole body of savages appeared swarming over the fields, so confident of success that they neglected their usual tactics of surprise. A French officer who, as an old English account says, was "habited like a gentleman," made them an harangue. They answered with bursts of yells, and then attacked the house, firing, screeching, and calling on Converse and his men to surrender. Others gave their attention to the 2 sloops, which lay together in the narrow creek, stranded by the ebbing tide. They fired at them for a while from behind a pile of planks on the shore, and threw many fine arrows without success, the men on board fighting with such cool and dexterous obstinacy that they held them all at bay, and lost but 1 of their own number. Next, the Canadians made a huge shield of planks, which they fastened vertically to the back of a cart. La Brognerie, with 26 men, French and Indians, got behind it, and shoved the cart towards the stranded sloops. It was within 50 feet of them, when a wheel sunk in the mud, and the machine stuck fast. La Brognerie tried to lift the wheel, and was shot dead. The tide began to rise. A Canadian tried to escape, and was also shot. The rest then broke away together, some of them, as they ran, dropping under the bullets of the sailors. The whole force now gathered for a final attack on the garrison house. Their appearance was so frightful, and their clamor so appalling, that one of the English muttered something about surrender. Converse returned, "If you say that again, you are a dead man." Had the allies made a bold assault, he and his followers must have been overpowered, but this mode of attack was contrary to Indian maxims. They merely leaped, yelled, fired, and called on the English to yield. They were answered with derision. The women in the house took part in the defense, passed ammunition to the men, and sometimes fired themselves on the enemy. The Indians at length became discouraged, and offered Converse favorable terms. He answered, "I want nothing but men to fight with." An Abenaki who spoke English cried out, "If you are so bold, why do you stay in a garrison house like a squaw? Come out and fight like a man." Converse retorted, "Do you think I'm fool enough to come out with 30 men to fight 500? Another Indian shouted, "Damn you! We'll cut you small as tobacco before morning." Converse returned a contemptuous defiance. After a while they ceased firing, and dispersed about the neighborhood, butchering cattle and burning the church and a few empty houses. As the tide began to ebb, they sent a fire raft in full blaze down the creek to destroy the sloops, but it stranded, and the attempt failed. They now wreaked their fury on the prisoner Diamond, whom they tortured to death, after which they all disappeared. A few resolute men had foiled one of the most formidable bands that ever took the warpath in Acadia. The warriors dispersed to their respective haunts, and when a band of them reached the St. John, Villebon coolly declares that he gave them a prisoner to burn. They put him to death with all their ingenuity of torture. The act on the part of the governor was more atrocious, as it had no motive of reprisal, and as the burning of prisoners was not the common practice of these tribes. The warlike ardor of the Abenakis cooled after the failure at Wells, and events that soon followed nearly extinguished it. Phips had just received his preposterous appointment to the government of Massachusetts. To the disgust of its inhabitants, the stubborn colony was no longer a republic. The new governor, unfit as he was for his office, understood the needs of the eastern frontier, where he had spent his youth, and he brought a royal order to rebuild the ruined fort at Pemaquid. The king gave the order, but neither men, money, nor munitions to execute it, and Massachusetts bore all the burden. Phips went to Pemaquid, laid out the work, and left 100 men to finish it. A strong fort of stone was built, the abandoned cannon of Casco mounted on its walls, and 60 men placed in garrison. The keen military eye of Frontenac saw the danger involved in the re-establishment of Pemaquid. Lying far in advance of the other English stations, it barred the passage of war parties along the coast, and it was a standing menace to the Abenakis. It was resolved to capture it. 2 ships of war, lately arrived at Quebec, the Poli and the Envieux, were ordered to sail for Acadia with above 400 men, take on board 200 or 300 Indians at Pentejet, reduce Pemaquid, and attack Wells, Portsmouth, and the Isles of Shoals, after which they were to scour the Acadian seas of Bostonnais fishermen. At this time a gentleman of Boston, John Nelson, captured by Villebon the year before, was a prisoner at Quebec. Nelson was nephew and heir of Sir Thomas Temple, in whose right he claimed the proprietorship of Acadia under an old grant of Oliver Cromwell. He was familiar both with that country and with Canada, which he had visited several times before the war. As he was a man of birth and breeding, and a declared enemy of Phipps, and as he had befriended French prisoners, and shown especial kindness to Meneval, the captive governor of Acadia, he was treated with distinction by Frontenac, who, though he knew him to be a determined enemy of the French, lodged him at the chateau, and entertained him at his own table. Madocawando, the father-in-law of Saint Castin, made a visit to Frontenac; and Nelson, who spoke both French and Indian, contrived to gain from him and from other sources a partial knowledge of the intended expedition. He was not in favor at Boston, for though one of the foremost in the overthrow of Andros, his creed and his character savored more of the Cavalier than of the Puritan. This did not prevent him from risking his life for the colony. He wrote a letter to the authorities of Massachusetts, and then bribed 2 soldiers to desert and carry it to them. The deserters were hotly pursued, but reached their destination, and delivered their letter. The 2 ships sailed from Quebec, but when, after a long delay at Mount Desert, they took on board the Indian allies and sailed onward to Pemaquid, they found an armed ship from Boston anchored in the harbor. Why they did not attack it is a mystery. The defenses of Pemaquid were still unfinished, the French force was far superior to the English, and Iberville, who commanded it, was a leader of unquestionable enterprise and daring. Nevertheless, the French did nothing, and soon after bore away for France. Frontenac was indignant, and severely blamed Iberville, whose sister was on board his ship, and was possibly the occasion of his inaction. Thus far successful, the authorities of Boston undertook an enterprise little to their credit. They employed the 2 deserters, joined with 2 Acadian prisoners, to kidnap Saint Castin, whom, next to the priest Thury, they regarded as their most insidious enemy. The Acadians revealed the plot, and the 2 soldiers were shot at Mount Desert. Nelson was sent to France, imprisoned 2 years in a dungeon of the Chateau of Angoulême, and then placed in the Bastille. 10 years passed before he was allowed to return to his family at Boston. The French failure at Pemaquid completed the discontent of the Abenakis, and despondency and terror seized them when, in the spring of 1693, Converse, the defender of Wells, ranged the frontier with a strong party of militia, and built another stone fort at the falls of the Saco. In July they opened a conference at Pemaquid; and in August 13 of their chiefs, representing or pretending to represent all the tribes from the Merrimac to the St. Croix, came again to the same place to conclude a final treaty of peace with the commissioners of Massachusetts. They renounced the French alliance, buried the hatchet, declared themselves British subjects, promised to give up all prisoners, and left 5 of their chief men as hostages. The frontier breathed again. Security and hope returned to secluded dwellings buried in a treacherous forest, where life had been a nightmare of horror and fear, and the settler could go to his work without dreading to find at evening his cabin burned and his wife and children murdered. He was fatally deceived, for the danger was not past. It is true that some of the Abenakis were sincere in their pledge of peace. A party among them, headed by Madocawando, were dissatisfied with the French, anxious to recover their captive countrymen, and eager to reopen trade with the English. But there was an opposing party, led by the chief Taxou, who still breathed war, while between the 2 was an unstable mob of warriors, guided by the impulse of the hour. The French spared no efforts to break off the peace. The 2 missionaries, Bigot on the Kennebec and Thury on the Penobscot, labored with unwearied energy to urge the savages to war. The governor Villebon flattered them, feasted them, adopted Texu as his brother, and to honor the occasion gave him his own best coat. 2,500 pounds of gunpowder, 6,000 pounds of lead, and a multitude of other presents were given this year to the Indians of Acadia. 2 of their chiefs had been sent to Versailles. They now returned in gay attire, their necks hung with medals, and their minds filled with admiration, wonder, and bewilderment. The special duty of commanding Indians had fallen to the lot of an officer named Villieux, who had been ordered by the court to raise a war party and attack the English. He had lately been sent to replace Portneuf, who had been charged with debauchery and peculation. Villebon, angry at his brother's removal, was on ill terms with his successor; and though he declares that he did his best to aid in raising the war party, Villieux says, on the contrary, that he was worse than indifferent. The new lieutenant spent the winter at Naxuat, and on the 1st of May went up in a canoe to the Malecite village of Medoctec, assembled the chiefs, and invited them to war. They accepted the invitation with alacrity. Villieux next made his way through the wilderness to the Indian towns of the Penobscot. On the 9th he reached the mouth of the Mattawamkeag, where he found the chief Texu, paddled with him down the Penobscot, and at midnight on the 10th, landed at a large Indian village, at or near the place now called Passadumkeag. Here he found a powerful ally in the Jesuit Vincent Bigot, who had come from the Kennebec with 3 Abenakis, to urge their brethren of the Penobscot to break off the peace. The chief envoy denounced the treaty of Pemaquid as a snare, and Villieux exhorted the assembled warriors to follow him to the English border, where honor and profit awaited them. But first he invited them to go back with him to Naxuat to receive their presents of arms, ammunition, and everything else that they needed. They set out with alacrity. Villieux went with them, and they all arrived within a week. They were feasted and gifted to their heart's content; and then the indefatigable officer led them back by the same long and weary routes which he had passed and repassed before, rocky and shallow streams, chains of wilderness lakes, threads of water writhing through swamps where the canoes could scarcely glide among the water weeds and alders. Villieux was the only white man. The governor, as he says, would give him but 2 soldiers, and these had run off. Early in June the whole flotilla paddled down the Penobscot to Pentejet. Here the Indians divided their presents, which they found somewhat less ample than they had imagined. In the midst of their discontent, Madocawando came from Pemaquid with news that the governor of Massachusetts was about to deliver up the Indian prisoners in his hands, as stipulated by the treaty. This completely changed the temper of the warriors. Madocawando declared loudly for peace, and Villieux saw all his hopes wrecked. He tried to persuade his disaffected allies that the English only meant to lure them to destruction, and the missionary Thury supported him with his utmost eloquence. The Indians would not be convinced, and their trust in English good faith was confirmed when they heard that a minister had just come to Pemaquid to teach their children to read and write. The news grew worse and worse. Villieux was secretly informed that Phipps had been off the coast in a frigate, invited Madocawando and other chiefs on board, and feasted them in his cabin, after which they had all thrown their hatchets into the sea, in token of everlasting peace. Villieux now despaired of his enterprise, and prepared to return to the St. John, when Thury, wise as the serpent, set himself to work on the jealousy of Texu, took him aside, and persuaded him that his rival, Madocawando, had put a slight upon him in presuming to make peace without his consent. The effect was marvelous, says Villieux. Texu, exasperated, declared that he would have nothing to do with Madacawando's treaty. The fickle multitude caught the contagion, and asked for nothing but English scalps; but before setting out, they must needs go back to Passadumkeag to finish their preparations. Villieux again went with them, and on the way his enterprise and he nearly perished together. His canoe overset in a rapid at some distance above the site of Bangor. He was swept down the current, his head was dashed against a rock, and his body bruised from head to foot. For 5 days he lay helpless with fever. He had no sooner recovered than he gave the Indians a war feast, at which they all sang the war song, except Madocawando and some 30 of his clansmen, whom the others made the butt of their taunts and ridicule. The chief began to waver. The officer and the missionary beset him with presents and persuasion, till at last he promised to join the rest. It was the end of June when Villeux and Thury, with 1 Frenchman and 105 Indians, began their long canoe voyage to the English border. The savages were directed to give no quarter, and told that the prisoners already in their hands would ensure the safety of their hostages in the hands of the English. More warriors were to join them from Bigot's mission on the Kennebec. On the 9th of July they neared Pemaquid, but it was no part of their plan to attack a garrisoned post. The main body passed on at a safe distance, while Villeux approached the fort, dressed and painted like an Indian, and accompanied by 2 or 3 genuine savages carrying a packet of furs, as if on a peaceful errand of trade. Such visits from Indians had been common since the treaty, and while his companions bartered their beaver skins with the unsuspecting soldiers, he strolled about the neighborhood and made a plan of the works. The party was soon after joined by Bigot's Indians, and the united force now amounted to 230. They held a council to determine where they should make their attack, but opinions differed. Some were for the places west of Boston, and others for those nearer at hand. Necessity decided them. Their provisions were gone, and Villeux says that he himself was dying of hunger. They therefore resolved to strike at the nearest settlement, that of Oyster River, now Durham, about 12 miles from Portsmouth. They cautiously moved forward, and sent scouts in advance, who reported that the inhabitants kept no watch. In fact, a messenger from Phipps had assured them that the war was over, and that they could follow their usual vocations without fear. Villeux and his band waited till night, and then made their approach. There was a small village, a church, a mill, 12 fortified houses, occupied in most cases only by families, and many unprotected farmhouses extending several miles along the stream. The Indians separated into bands, and stationing themselves for a simultaneous attack at numerous points, lay patiently waiting till towards day. The moon was still bright when the first shot gave the signal, and the slaughter began. The 2 palisaded houses of Adams and Drew, without garrisons, were taken immediately, and the families butchered. Those of Edgerly, Beard, and Medar were abandoned, and most of the inmates escaped. The remaining 7 were successfully defended, though several of them were occupied only by the families which owned them. One of these, belonging to Thomas Bickford, stood by the river near the lower end of the settlement. Roused by the firing, he placed his wife and children in a boat, sent them down the stream, and then went back alone to defend his dwelling. When the Indians appeared, he fired on them, sometimes from one loophole and sometimes from another, shouting the word of command to an imaginary garrison, and showing himself with a different hat, cap, or coat, at different parts of the building. The Indians were afraid to approach, and he saved both family and home. One Jones, the owner of another of these fortified houses, was wakened by the barking of his dogs, and went out, thinking that his hog pen was visited by wolves. The flash of a gun in the twilight of the morning showed the true nature of the attack. The shot missed him narrowly, and entering the house again, he stood on his defense, when the Indians, after firing for some time from behind a neighboring rock, withdrew and left him in peace. Woodman's garrison house, though occupied by a number of men, was attacked more seriously, the Indians keeping up a long and brisk fire from behind a ridge where they lay sheltered; but they hit nobody, and at length disappeared. Among the unprotected houses the carnage was horrible. 104 persons, chiefly women and children, half naked from their beds, were tomahawked, shot, or killed by slower and more painful methods. Some escaped to the fortified houses, and others hid in the woods. 27 were kept alive as prisoners. 20 or more houses were burned; but what is remarkable, the church was spared. Father Thury entered it during the massacre, and wrote with chalk on the pulpit some sentences, of which the purport is not preserved, as they were no doubt in French or Latin. Thury said mass, and then the victors retreated in a body to the place where they had hidden their canoes. Here Texu, dissatisfied with the scalps that he and his band had taken, resolved to have more, and with 50 of his own warriors, joined by others from the Kennebec, set out on a new enterprise. "They mean," writes Villeux in his diary, "to divide into bands of 4 or 5, and knock people in the head by surprise, which cannot fail to produce a good effect." They did, in fact, fall a few days after on the settlements near Groton, and killed some 40 persons. Having heard from one of the prisoners a rumor of ships on the way from England to attack Quebec, Villeux thought it necessary to inform Frontenac at once. Attended by a few Indians, he traveled 4 days and nights till he found Bigot at an Abenaki fort on the Kennebec. His Indians were completely exhausted. He took others in their place, pushed forward again, reached Quebec on the 22nd of August, found that Frontenac had gone to Montreal, followed him thither, told his story, and presented him with 13 English scalps. He had displayed in the achievement of his detestable exploit an energy, perseverance, and hardihood rarely equaled; but all would have been vain but for the help of his clerical colleague, Father Pierre Thury. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of France and England in North America, Part 5. Count Frontenac, New France, Louis XIV, by Francis Parkman, Jr. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17. 1690 to 1697. New France and New England. This stroke, says Villebon, speaking of the success at Oyster River, is of great advantage, because it breaks off all the talk of peace between our Indians and the English. The English are in despair, for not even infants in the cradle were spared. I have given the story in detail as showing the origin and character of the destructive raids, of which New England annalists show only the results. The borders of New England were peculiarly vulnerable. In Canada, the settlers built their houses in lines within supporting distance of each other, along the margin of a river which supplied easy transportation for troops, and in time of danger they all took refuge in forts under command of the local seigneurs, or of officers with detachment of soldiers. The exposed part of the French colony extended along the St. Lawrence about 90 miles. The exposed frontier of New England was between 200 and 300 miles long, and consisted of farms and hamlets, loosely scattered through an almost impervious forest. Mutual support was difficult or impossible. A body of Indians and Canadians approaching secretly and swiftly, dividing into small bands, and falling at once upon the isolated houses of an extensive district, could commit prodigious havoc in a short time and with little danger. Even in so-called villages the houses were far apart because, except on the seashore, the people lived by farming. Such as were able to do so fenced their dwellings with palisades, or built them of solid timber with loopholes, a projecting upper story like a blockhouse, and sometimes a flanker at one or more of the corners. In the more considerable settlements, the largest of these fortified houses was occupied, in time of danger, by armed men, and served as a place of refuge for the neighbors. The palisaded house defended by converse at Wells was of this sort, and so also was the Woodman House at Oyster River. These were garrison houses, properly so called, though the name was often given to fortified dwellings occupied only by the family. The French and Indian war parties commonly avoided the true garrison houses, and very rarely captured them, except unawares; for their tactics were essentially Iroquois, and consisted, for the most part, in pouncing upon peaceful settlers by surprise, and generally in the night. Combatants and non-combatants were slaughtered together. By parading the number of slain, without mentioning that most of them were women and children, and by counting as forts mere private houses surrounded with palisades, Charlevoix and later writers have given the air of gallant exploits to acts which deserve a very different name. To attack military posts like Casco and Pemaquid was a legitimate act of war, but systematically to butcher helpless farmers and their families can hardly pass as such, except from the Iroquois point of view. The chief alleged motive for this ruthless warfare was to prevent the people of New England from invading Canada, by giving them employment at home, though in fact they had never thought of invading Canada till after these attacks began. But for the intrigues of Denonville, the Bigot, Thury, and St. Castin, before war was declared, and the destruction of Salmon Falls after it, Phips's expedition would never have taken place. By successful raids against the borders of New England, Frontenac roused the Canadians from their dejection, and prevented his bad allies from deserting him; but in doing so, he brought upon himself an enemy who, as Charlevoix himself says, asked only to be let alone. If there was a political necessity for butchering women and children on the frontier of New England, it was a necessity created by the French themselves. There was no such necessity. Massachusetts was the only one of the New England colonies which took an aggressive part in the contest. Connecticut did little or nothing. Rhode Island was non-combatant through Quaker influence, and New Hampshire was too weak for offensive war. Massachusetts was in no condition to fight, nor was she impelled to do so by the home government. Canada was organized for war, and must fight at the bidding of the king, who made the war and paid for it. Massachusetts was organized for peace, and if she chose an aggressive part, it was at her own risk and her own cost. She had had fighting enough already against infuriated savages far more numerous than the Iroquois, and poverty and political revolution made peace a necessity to her. If there was danger of another attack on Quebec, it was not from New England, but from old, and no amount of frontier butchery could avert it. Nor, except their inveterate habit of poaching on Acadian fisheries, had the people of New England provoked these barbarous attacks. They never even attempted to retaliate them, though the settlements of Acadia offered a safe and easy revenge. Once, it is true, they pillaged Beaubassin, but they killed nobody, though countless butcheries in the settlements yet more defenseless were fresh in their memory. With New York, a colony separate in government and widely sundered in local position, the case was different. Its rulers had instigated the Iroquois to attack Canada, possibly before the declaration of war and certainly after it, and they had no right to complain of reprisal. Yet the frontier of New York was less frequently assailed because it was less exposed, while that of New England was drenched in blood because it was open to attack, because the Abenakis were convenient instruments for attacking it, because the adhesion of these tribes was necessary to the maintenance of French power in Acadia, and because this adhesion could best be secured by inciting them to constant hostility against the English. They were not only needed as the barrier of Canada against New England, but the French commanders hoped, by means of their tomahawks, to drive the English beyond the Piscataqua, and secure the whole of Maine to the French crown. Who were answerable for these offenses against Christianity and civilization? First, the king, and next the governors and military officers who were charged with executing his orders, and who often executed them with needless barbarity. But a far different responsibility rests on the missionary priests who hounded their converts on the track of innocent blood. The Acadian priests are not all open to this charge. Some of them are even accused of being too favorable to the English, while others gave themselves to their proper work, and neither abused their influence nor perverted their teaching to political ends. The most prominent among the apostles of carnage at this time are the Jesuit Bigot on the Kennebec, and the seminary priest Thury on the Penobscot. There is little doubt that the latter instigated attacks on the English frontier before the war, and there is conclusive evidence that he had a hand in repeated forays after it began. Whether acting from fanaticism, policy, or an odious compound of both, he was found so useful that the minister Pontchartrain twice wrote him letters of commendation, praising him in the same breath for his care of the souls of the Indians and his zeal in exciting them to war. "There is no better man," says an Acadian official, "to prompt the savages to any enterprise." The king was begged to reward him with money, and Pontchartrain wrote to the Bishop of Quebec to increase his pay out of the allowance furnished by the government to the Acadian clergy, because he, Thury, had persuaded the Abenakis to begin the war anew. The French missionaries are said to have made use of singular methods to excite their flocks against the heretics. The Abenaki chief Bomoseen, when a prisoner at Boston in 1696, declared that they told the Indians that Jesus Christ was a Frenchman, and his mother, the Virgin, a French lady; that the English had murdered him, and that the best way to gain his favor was to revenge his death. Whether or not these articles of faith formed a part of the teachings of Thury and his fellow apostles, there is no doubt that it was recognized part of their functions to keep their converts in hostility to the English, and that their credit with the civil powers depended on their success in doing so. The same holds true of the priests of the mission villages in Canada. They avoided all that might impair the warlike spirit of the neophyte, and they were well aware that in savages the warlike spirit is mainly dependent on native ferocity. They taught temperance, conjugal fidelity, devotion to the rites of their religion, and submission to the priest; but they left the savage a savage still. In spite of the remonstrances of the civil authorities, the mission Indian was separated as far as possible from intercourse with the French, and discouraged from learning the French tongue. He wore a crucifix, hung wampum on the shrine of the Virgin, told his beads, prayed 3 times a day, knelt for hours before the Host, invoked the saints, and confessed to the priest; but with rare exceptions he murdered, scalped, and tortured like his heathen countrymen. The picture has another side, which must not pass unnoticed. Early in the war, the French of Canada began the merciful practice of buying English prisoners, and especially children, from their Indian allies. After the first fury of attack, many lives were spared for the sake of this ransom. Sometimes, but not always, the redeemed captives were made to work for their benefactors. They were uniformly treated well, and often with such kindness that they would not be exchanged, and became Canadians by adoption. Villebon was still full of anxiety as to the adhesion of the Abenakis. Thury saw the danger still more clearly, and told Frontenac that their late attack at Oyster River was due more to levity than to any other cause; that they were greatly alarmed, wavering, half stupefied, afraid of the English, and distrustful of the French, whom they accused of using them as tools. It was clear that something must be done; and nothing could answer the purpose so well as the capture of Pemaquid, that English stronghold which held them in constant menace, and at the same time tempted them by offers of goods at a low rate. To the capture of Pemaquid, therefore, the French government turned its thoughts. One Pasco Chubb, of Andover, commanded the post, with a garrison of 95 militiamen. Stoughton, governor of Massachusetts, had written to the Abenakis, upbraiding them for breaking the peace, and ordering them to bring in their prisoners without delay. The Indians of Bigot's mission, that is to say Bigot in their name, retorted by a letter to the last degree haughty and abusive. Those of Thury's mission, however, were so anxious to recover their friends held in prison at Boston that they came to Pemaquid, and opened a conference with Chubb. The French say that they meant only to deceive him. This does not justify the Massachusetts officer who, by an act of odious treachery, killed several of them and captured the chief, Egeremais. Nor was this the only occasion on which the English had acted in bad faith. It was but playing into the hands of the French, who saw with delight that the folly of their enemies had aided their own intrigues. Early in 1696, 2 ships of war, the Envieux and the Profond, one commanded by Iberville and the other by Bonaventure, sailed from Rochefort to Quebec, where they took on board 80 troops and Canadians; then proceeded to Cape Breton, embarked 30 Micmac Indians, and steered for the St. John. Here they met 2 British frigates and a provincial tender belonging to Massachusetts. A fight ensued. The forces were very unequal. The Newport, of 24 guns, was dismasted and taken, but her companion frigate along with the tender escaped in the fog. The French then anchored at the mouth of the St. John, where Villebon and the priest Simon were waiting for them, with 50 more Micmacs. Simon and the Indians went on board, and they all sailed for Pentejet, where Villieux, with 25 soldiers, and Thury and Saint Castin, with some 300 Abenakis, were ready to join them. After the usual feasting, these new allies paddled for Pemaquid, the ships followed, and on the next day, the 14th of August, they all reached their destination. The fort of Pemaquid stood at the west side of the promontory of the same name, on a rocky point at the mouth of Pemaquid River. It was a quadrangle with ramparts of rough stone, built at great pains and cost, but exposed to artillery, and incapable of resisting heavy shot. The government of Massachusetts, with its usual military fatuity, had placed it in the keeping of an unfit commander, and permitted some of the yeoman garrison to bring their wives and children to this dangerous and important post. Saint Castin and his Indians landed at New Harbor, half a league from the fort. Troops and cannon were sent ashore, and at 5 o'clock in the afternoon Chubb was summoned to surrender. He replied that he would fight, even if the sea were covered with French ships and the land with Indians. The firing then began, and the Indian marksmen, favored by the nature of the ground, ensconced themselves near the fort, well covered from its cannon. During the night, mortars and heavy ship's guns were landed, and by great exertion were got into position, the 2 priests working lustily with the rest. They opened fire at 3 o'clock on the next day. Saint Castin had just before sent Chubb a letter telling him that, if the garrison were obstinate, they would get no quarter, and would be butchered by the Indians. Close upon this message followed 4 or 5 bombshells. Chubb succumbed immediately, sounded a parley, and gave up the fort, on condition that he and his men should be protected from the Indians, sent to Boston, and exchanged for French and Abenaki prisoners. They all marched out without arms, and Iberville, true to his pledge, sent them to an island in the bay, beyond the reach of his red allies. Villieux took possession of the fort, where an Indian prisoner was found in irons, half dead from long confinement. This so enraged his countrymen that a massacre would infallibly have taken place but for the precaution of Iberville. The cannon of Pemaquid were carried on board the ships, and the small arms and ammunition given to the Indians. 2 days were spent in destroying the works, and then the victors withdrew in triumph. Disgraceful as was the prompt surrender of the fort, it may be doubted if, even with the best defense, it could have held out many days, for it had no casemates, and its occupants were defenseless against the explosion of shells. Chubb was arrested for cowardice on his return, and remained some months in prison. After his release, he returned to his family at Andover, 20 miles from Boston, and here, in the year following, he and his wife were killed by Indians, who seem to have pursued him to this apparently safe asylum to take revenge for his treachery toward their countrymen. The people of Massachusetts, compelled by a royal order to build and maintain Pemaquid, had no love for it, and underrated its importance. Having been accustomed to spend their money as they themselves saw fit, they revolted at compulsion, though exercised for their good. Pemaquid was nevertheless of the utmost value for the preservation of their hold on Maine, and its conquest was a crowning triumph to the French. The conquerors now projected a greater exploit. The Marquis de Nesmond, with a powerful squadron of 15 ships, including some of the best in the Royal Navy, sailed to Newfoundland, with orders to defeat an English squadron supposed to be there, and then to proceed to the mouth of the Penobscot, where he was to join by the Abenaki warriors and 1,500 troops from Canada. The whole united force was then to fall upon Boston. The French had an exact knowledge of the place. Meneval, when a prisoner there, lodged in the house of John Nelson, had carefully examined it, and so also had the Chevalier d'Eau, while Lamotte Cadillac had reconnoitred the town and harbor before the war began. An accurate map of them was made for the use of the expedition, and the plan of operations was arranged with great care. 1,200 troops and Canadians were to land with artillery at Dorchester, and march at once to force the barricade across the neck of the peninsula on which the town stood. At the same time, St. Castin was to land at Noddle's Island with a troop of Canadians and all the Indians, pass over in canoes to Charlestown, and after mastering it, cross to the north point of Boston, which would thus be attacked at both ends. During these movements, 200 soldiers were to seize the battery on Castle Island, and then land in front of the town near Long Wharf, under the guns of the fleet. Boston had about 7,000 inhabitants, but owing to the seafaring habits of the people, many of its best men were generally absent, and in the belief of the French, its available force did not much exceed 800. "There are no soldiers in the place," says the directions for attack. "At least there were none last September, except the garrison from Pemaquid, who do not deserve the name." An easy victory was expected. After Boston was taken, the land forces, French and Indian, were to march on Salem, and thence northward to Portsmouth, conquering as they went, while the ships followed along the coast to lend aid when necessary. All captured places were to be completely destroyed after removing all valuable property. A portion of this plunder was to be abandoned to the officers and men, in order to encourage them, and the rest stowed in the ships for transportation to France. Notice of the proposed expedition had reached Frontenac in the spring, and he began at once to collect men, canoes, and supplies for the long and arduous march to the rendezvous. He saw clearly the uncertainties of the attempt, but in spite of his 77 years, he resolved to command the land force in person. He was ready in June, and waited only to hear from Nesmond. The summer passed, and it was not till September that a ship reached Quebec with a letter from the Marquis, telling him that headwinds had detained the fleet till only 50 days' provision remained, and it was too late for action. The enterprise had completely failed, and even at Newfoundland nothing was accomplished. It proved a positive advantage to New England, since a host of Indians, who would otherwise have been turned loose upon the borders, were gathered by St. Castin at the Penobscot to wait for the fleet, and kept there idle all summer. It is needless to dwell farther on the war in Acadia. There were petty combats by land and sea. Villieux was captured and carried to Boston. A band of New England rustics made a futile attempt to dislodge Villebon from his fort at Naxuat; while throughout the contest, rivalry and jealousy rankled among the French officials, who continually maligned each other in tell-tale letters to the court. Their hope that the Abenakis would force back the English boundary to the Piscataqua was never fulfilled. At Kittery, at Wells, and even among the ashes of York, the stubborn settlers held their ground, while war parties prowled along the whole frontier from the Kennebec to the Connecticut. A single incident will show the nature of the situation, and the qualities which it sometimes called forth. Early in the spring that followed the capture of Pemaquid, a band of Indians fell after daybreak on a number of farmhouses near the village of Haverhill. One of them belonged to a settler named Dustin, whose wife Hannah had borne a child a week before, and lay in the house nursed by Mary Neff, one of the neighbors. Dustin had gone to his work in a neighboring field, taking with him his 7 children, of whom the youngest was 2 years old. Hearing the noise of the attack, he told them to run to the nearest fortified house, a mile or more distant, and snatching up his gun, threw himself on one of his horses, and galloped towards his own house to save his wife. It was too late. The Indians were already there. He now thought only of saving his children; and keeping behind them as they ran, he fired on the pursuing savages, and held them at bay till he and his flock reached a place of safety. Meanwhile the house was set on fire, and his wife and the nurse carried off. Her husband no doubt had given her up as lost, when, weeks after, she reappeared, accompanied by Mary Neff and a boy, and bringing 10 Indian scalps. Her story was to the following effect. The Indians had killed the new-born child by dashing it against a tree, after which the mother and the nurse were dragged into the forest, where they found a number of friends and neighbors, their fellows in misery. Some of these were presently tomahawked, and the rest divided among their captors. Hannah Dustin and the nurse fell to the share of a family consisting of 2 warriors, 3 squaws, and 7 children, who separated from the rest, and, hunting as they went, moved northward towards an Abenaki village, 250 miles distant, probably that of the mission on the Chaudiere. Every morning, noon, and evening they told their beads and repeated their prayers. An English boy captured at Worcester was also of the party. After a while the Indians began to amuse themselves by telling the women that when they reached the village they would be stripped, made to run the gauntlet, and severely beaten, according to custom. Hannah Dustin now resolved on a desperate effort to escape, and Mary Neff and the boy agreed to join in it. They were in the depths of the forest, half-way on their journey, and the Indians, who had no distrust of them, were all asleep about their camp-fire, when late in the night the 2 women and the boy took each a hatchet, and crouched silently by the bare heads of the unconscious savages. Then they all struck at once, with blows so rapid and true that 10 of the 12 were killed before they were well awake. One old squaw sprang up wounded, and ran screeching into the forest, followed by a small boy whom they had purposely left unharmed. Hannah Dustin and her companions watched by the corpses till daylight. Then the Amazons scalped them all, and the 3 made their way back to the settlements with the trophies of their exploit. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of France and England in North America, Part 5. Count Frontenac, New France, Louis XIV, by Francis Parkman, Jr. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18. 1693 to 1697. French and English rivalry. No Canadian under the French rule stands in a more conspicuous or more deserved eminence than Pierre Le Moyne d'Iberville. In the 17th century, most of those who acted a prominent part in the colony were born in Old France; but Iberville was a true son of the soil. He and his brothers Longueuil, Sérigny, Assigny, Maricourt, Sainte Helene, the 2 Chateauguays, and the 2 Bienville, were one and all children worthy of their father, Charles Le Moyne of Montreal, and favorable types of that Canadian noblesse to whose adventurous hardihood half the continent bears witness. Iberville was trained in the French navy, and was already among its most able commanders. The capture of Pemaquid was for him but the beginning of greater things; and though the exploits that followed were outside the main theatre of action, they were too remarkable to be passed in silence. The French had but 1 post of any consequence on the island of Newfoundland, the fort and village at Placentia Bay. while the English fishermen had formed a line of settlements 200 or 300 miles along the eastern coast. Iberville had represented to the court the necessity of checking their growth, and to that end a plan was settled in connection with the expedition against Pemaquid. The ships of the king were to transport the men, while Iberville and others associated with him were to pay them and divide the plunder as their compensation. The chronicles of the time show various similar bargains between the great king and his subjects. Pemaquid was no sooner destroyed than Iberville sailed for Newfoundland with the 80 men he had taken at Quebec, and on arriving he was joined by as many more sent him from the same place. He found Brouillan, governor of Placentia, with a squadron formed largely of privateers from St. Malo, engaged in a vain attempt to seize St. John, the chief post of the English. Brouillan was a man of harsh, jealous, and impracticable temper, and it was with the utmost difficulty that he and Iberville could act in concert. They came at last to an agreement, made a combined attack on St. John, took it, and burned it to the ground. Then followed a new dispute about the division of the spoils. At length it was settled. Brouillan went back to Placentia, and Iberville and his men were left to pursue their conquest alone. There were no British soldiers on the island. The settlers were rude fishermen without commanders, and, according to the French accounts, without religion or morals. In fact, they are described as worse than Indians. Iberville now had with him 125 soldiers and Canadians, besides a few Abenakis from Acadia. It was midwinter when he began his march. For 2 months he led his hardy band through frost and snow, from hamlet to hamlet, along those forlorn and desolate coasts, attacking each in turn and carrying havoc everywhere. Nothing could exceed the hardships of the way, or the vigor with which they were met and conquered. The chaplain Baudouin gives an example of them in his diary, January 18th. "The roads are so bad that we can find only 12 men strong enough to beat the path. Our snowshoes break on the crust and against the rocks and fallen trees hidden under the snow, which catch and trip us. But for all that, we cannot help laughing to see now one and now another fall headlong. Le Sieur de Martigny fell into a river, and left his gun and his sword there to save his life." A panic seized the settlers, many of whom were without arms as well as without leaders. They imagined the Canadians to be savages, who scalped and butchered like the Iroquois. Their resistance was feeble and incoherent, and Iberville carried all before him. Every hamlet was pillaged and burned, and, according to the incredible report of the French writers, 200 persons were killed and 700 captured, though it is admitted that most of the prisoners escaped. When spring opened, all the English settlements were destroyed, except the post of Bonavista and the island of Carbonniere, a natural fortress in the sea. Iberville returned to Placentia, to prepare for completing his conquest, when his plans were broken by the arrival of his brother Serigny, with orders to proceed at once against the English at Hudson's Bay. It was the 19th of May when Serigny appeared with 5 ships of war, the Pélican, the Palmier, the Wesp, the Profond, and the Violent. The important trading post of Fort Nelson, called Fort Bourbon by the French, was the destined object of attack. Iberville and Serigny had captured it 3 years before, but the English had retaken it during the past summer, and as it commanded the fur trade of a vast interior region, a strong effort was now to be made for its recovery. Iberville took command of the Pélican and his brother of the Palmier. They sailed from Placentia early in July, followed by 2 other ships of the squadron and a vessel carrying stores. Before the end of the month they entered the bay, where they were soon caught among masses of floating ice. The store ship was crushed and lost, and the rest were in extreme danger. The Pélican at last extricated herself and sailed into the open sea, but her 3 consorts were nowhere to be seen. Iberville steered for Fort Nelson, which was several hundred miles distant, on the western shore of this dismal inland sea. He had nearly reached it when 3 sail hove in sight, and he did not doubt that they were his missing ships. They proved, however, to be English armed merchantmen, the Hampshire of 52 guns, and the Daring and the Hudson's Bay of 36 and 32. The Pélican carried but 44, and she was alone. A desperate battle followed, and from 9:30 to 1 o'clock the cannonade was incessant. Iberville kept the advantage of the wind, and coming at length to close quarters with the Hampshire, gave her repeated broadsides between wind and water, with such effect that she sank with all on board. The next closed with the Hudson's Bay, which soon struck her flag; while the Dering made sail and escaped. The Pelican was badly damaged in hull, masts, and rigging; and the increasing fury of a gale from the east made her position more critical every hour. She anchored, to escape being driven ashore; but the cables parted, and she was stranded about 2 leagues from the fort. Here, racked by the waves and the tide, she split amidships; but most of the crew reached land with their weapons and ammunition. The northern winter had already begun, and the snow lay a foot deep in the forest. Some of them died from cold and exhaustion, and the rest built huts and kindled fires to warm and dry themselves. Food was so scarce that their only hope of escape from famishing seemed to lie in a desperate effort to carry the fort by storm, but now fortune interposed. The 3 ships they had left behind in the ice arrived with all the needed succors. Men, cannon, and mortars were sent ashore, and the attack began. Fort Nelson was a palisade work, garrisoned by traders and other civilians in the employ of the English Fur Company, and commanded by one of its agents, named Bailey. Though it had a considerable number of small cannon, it was incapable of defense against anything but musketry, and the French bombs soon made it untenable. After being 3 times summoned, Bailey lowered his flag, though not till he had obtained honorable terms; and he and his men marched out with arms and baggage, drums beating, and colors flying. Iberville had triumphed over the storms, the icebergs, and the English. The North had seen his prowess, and another fame awaited him in the regions of the sun; for he became the father of Louisiana, and his brother Bienville founded New Orleans. These northern conflicts were but episodes. In Hudson's Bay, Newfoundland, and Acadia, the issues of the war were unimportant compared with the momentous question whether France or England should be mistress of the West, that is to say, of the whole interior of the continent. There was a strange contrast in the attitude of the rival colonies towards this supreme prize; the one was inert and seemingly indifferent; the other intensely active. The reason is obvious enough. The English colonies were separate, jealous of the crown and of each other, and incapable as yet of acting in concert. Living by agriculture and trade, they could prosper within limited areas, and had no present need of spreading beyond the Alleghanies. Each of them was an aggregate of persons busied with their own affairs, and giving little heed to matters which did not immediately concern them. Their rulers, whether chosen by themselves or appointed in England, could not compel them to become the instruments of enterprises in which the sacrifice was present and the advantage remote. The neglect in which the English court left them, though wholesome in most respects, made them unfit for aggressive action; for they had neither troops, commanders, political union, military organization, nor military habits. In communities so busy, and governments so popular, much could not be done in war till the people were roused to the necessity of doing it; and that awakening was still far distant. Even New York, the only exposed colony except Massachusetts and New Hampshire, regarded the war merely as a nuisance to be held at arm's length. In Canada all was different. Living by the fur trade, she needed free range and indefinite space. Her geographical position determined the nature of her pursuits, and her pursuits developed the roving and adventurous character of her people, who, living under a military rule, could be directed at will to such ends as their rulers saw fit. The grand French scheme of territorial extension was not born at court, but sprang from Canadian soil, and was developed by the chiefs of the colony, who, being on the ground, saw the possibilities and requirements of the situation, and generally had a personal interest in realizing them. The rival colonies had 2 different laws of growth. The one increased by slow extension, rooting firmly as it spread; the other shot offshoots with few or no roots, far out into the wilderness. It was the nature of French colonization to seize upon detached strategic points, and hold them by the bayonet, forming no agricultural basis, but attracting the Indians by trade, and holding them by conversion. A musket, a rosary, and a pack of beaver skins may serve to represent it, and in fact it consisted of little else. Whence came the numerical weakness of New France, and the real though latent strength of her rivals? Because it is answered, the French were not an emigrating people; but at the end of the 17th century this was only half true, The French people were divided into two parts, one eager to emigrate and the other reluctant. The one consisted of the persecuted Huguenots, the other of the favored Catholics. The government chose to construct its colonies, not of those who wished to go, but of those who wished to stay at home. From the hour when the Edict of Nantes was revoked, hundreds of thousands of Frenchmen would have hailed as a boon the permission to transport themselves, their families, and their property to the New World. The permission was fiercely refused, and the persecuted sect was denied even a refuge in the wilderness. Had it been granted them, the valleys of the West would have swarmed with a laborious and virtuous population, trained in adversity, and possessing the essential qualities of self-government. Another France would have grown beyond the Alleghanies, strong with the same kind of strength that made the future greatness of the British colonies. British America was an asylum for the oppressed and the suffering of all creeds and nations, and population poured into her by the force of a natural tendency. France, like England, might have been great in two hemispheres, if she had placed herself in accord with this tendency instead of opposing it, but despotism was consistent with itself, and a mighty opportunity was forever lost. As soon could the Ethiopian change his skin as the priest-ridden king change his fatal policy of exclusion. Canada must be bound to the papacy, even if it blasted her. The contest for the West must be waged by the means which Bourbon policy ordained, and which, it must be admitted, had some great advantages of their own when controlled by a man like Frontenac. The result hung for the present on the relations of the French with the Iroquois and the tribes of the Lakes, the Illinois, and the valley of the Ohio, but above all on their relations with the Iroquois; for could they be conquered or won over, it would be easy to deal with the rest. Frontenac was meditating a grand effort to inflict such castigation as would bring them to reason, when one of their chiefs, named Tareja, came to Quebec with overtures of peace. The Iroquois had lost many of their best warriors. The arrival of troops from France had discouraged them; the war had interrupted their hunting; and having no furs to barter with the English, they were in want of arms, ammunition, and all the necessaries of life. Moreover, Father Millet, nominally a prisoner among them, but really an adopted chief, had used all his influence to bring about a peace, and the mission of Tareja was the result. Frontenac received him kindly. "My Iroquois children have been drunk; but I will give them an opportunity to repent. Let each of your 5 nations send me 2 deputies, and I will listen to what they have to say." They would not come, but sent him instead an invitation to meet them and their friends the English in a general council at Albany, a proposal which he rejected with contempt. Then they sent another deputation, partly to him and partly to their Christian countrymen of the Sault and the Mountain, inviting all alike to come and treat with them at Onondaga. Frontenac, adopting the Indian fashion, kicked away their wampum belts, rebuked them for tampering with the mission Indians, and told them that they were rebels bribed by the English, adding that, if a suitable deputation should be sent to Quebec to treat squarely of peace, he still would listen, but that, if they came back with any more such proposals as they had just made, they should be roasted alive. A few weeks later the deputation appeared. It consisted of 2 chiefs of each nation, headed by the renowned orator de Canesora, or as the French wrote the name, Teganisorans. The council was held in the hall of the Supreme Council at Quebec. The dignitaries of the colony were present, with priests, Jesuits, Récollets, officers, and the Christian chiefs of the Sault and the Mountain. The appearance of the ambassadors bespoke their destitute plight, for they were all dressed in shabby deerskins and old blankets, except Tecanosora, who was attired in a scarlet coat laced with gold, given him by the governor of New York. Colden, who knew him in his old age, describes him as a tall, well-formed man, with a face not unlike the busts of Cicero. "He spoke," says the French reporter, "with as perfect a grace as is vouchsafed to an uncivilized people; buried the hatchet, covered the blood that had been spilled, opened the roads, and cleared the clouds from the sun." In other words, he offered peace; but he demanded at the same time that it should include the English. Frontenac replied in substance, "My children are right to come submissive and repentant. I am ready to forgive the past, and hang up the hatchet; but the peace must include all my other children, far and near. Shut your ears to English poison. The war with the English has nothing to do with you, and only the great kings across the sea have power to stop it. You must give up all your prisoners, both French and Indian, without one exception. I will then return mine, and make peace with you, but not before." He then entertained them at his own table, gave them a feast described as magnificent, and bestowed gifts so liberally that the tattered ambassadors went home in embroidered coats, laced shirts, and plumed hats. They were pledged to return with the prisoners before the end of the season, and they left 2 hostages as security. Meanwhile the authorities of New York tried to prevent the threatened peace. First, Major Peter Schuyler convoked the chiefs at Albany and told them that, if they went to ask peace in Canada, they would be slaves forever. The Iroquois declared that they loved the English, but they repelled every attempt to control their action. Then Fletcher, the governor, called a general council at the same place, and told them that they should not hold councils with the French, or that, if they did so, they should hold them at Albany in presence of the English. Again they asserted their rights as an independent people. "Corlaer," said their speaker, "has held councils with our enemies, and why should not we hold councils with his?" Yet they were strong in assurances of friendship, and declared themselves one head, one heart, one blood, and one soul with the English. Their speaker continued, "Our only reason for sending deputies to the French is that we are brought so low, and none of our neighbors help us, but leave us to bear all the burden of the war. Our brothers of New England, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia, all of their own accord took hold of the covenant chain and called themselves our allies; but they have done nothing to help us, and we cannot fight the French alone, because they are always receiving soldiers from beyond the Great Lake. Speak from your heart, brother. Will you and your neighbors join with us, and make strong war against the French? If you will, we will break off all treaties, and fight them as hotly as ever; but if you will not help us, we must make peace." Nothing could be more just than these reproaches, and if the English governor had answered by a vigorous attack on the French forts south of the St. Lawrence, the Iroquois warriors would have raised the hatchet again with one accord. But Fletcher was busy with other matters, and he had besides no force at his disposal but 4 companies, the only British regulars on the continent, defective in numbers, ill appointed, and mutinous. Therefore he answered not with acts but with words. The negotiation with the French went on, and Fletcher called another council. It left him in a worse position than before. The Iroquois again asked for help. He could not promise it, but was forced to yield the point and tell them that he consented to their making peace with the nuncio. It is certain that they wanted peace, but equally certain that they did not want it to be lasting, and sought nothing more than a breathing time to regain their strength. Even now some of them were continuing the war, and at the great council at Onondaga, where the matter was debated, the Onondagas, Oneidas, and Mohawks spurned the French proposals, and refused to give up their prisoners. The Cayugas and some of the Senecas were of another mind, and agreed to a partial compliance with Frontenac's demands. The rest seem to have stood passive in the hope of gaining time. They were disappointed. In vain the Seneca and Cayuga deputies buried the hatchet at Montreal, and promised that the other nations would soon do likewise. Frontenac was not to be deceived. He would accept nothing but the frank fulfillment of his conditions, refused the proffered peace, and told his Indian allies to wage war to the knife. There was a dog feast and a war dance, and the strife began anew. In all these conferences the Iroquois had stood by their English allies with a fidelity not too well merited. But though they were loyal towards the English, they had acted with duplicity towards the French, and, while treating of peace with them, had attacked some of their Indian allies, and intrigued with others. They pursued with more persistency than ever the policy they had adopted in the time of La Barre, that is, to persuade or frighten the tribes of the West to abandon the French, join hands with them and the English, and send their furs to Albany instead of Montreal; for the sagacious Confederates knew well that if the trade were turned into this new channel their local position would enable them to control it. The scheme was good, but with whatever consistency their chiefs and elders might pursue it, the wayward ferocity of their young warriors crossed it incessantly, and murders alternated with intrigues. On the other hand, the western tribes, who since the war had been but ill supplied with French goods and French brandy, knew that they could have English goods and English rum in great abundance, and at far less cost, and thus, in spite of hate and fear, the intrigue went on. Michilimackinac was the focus of it, but it pervaded all the West. The position of Frontenac was one of great difficulty, and the more so that the intestine quarrels of his allies excessively complicated the mazes of forest diplomacy. This heterogeneous multitude, scattered in tribes and groups of tribes over 2,000 miles of wilderness, was like a vast menagerie of wild animals, and the lynx bristled at the wolf, and the panther grinned fury at the bear, in spite of all his efforts to form them into a happy family under his paternal rule. Lamotte Cadillac commanded at Michilimackinac, Courtemanche was stationed at Fort Miamis, and Tonty and La Forêt at the fortified rock of St. Louis on the Illinois, while Nicolas Perrot roamed among the tribes of the Mississippi, striving at the risk of his life to keep them at peace with each other, and in alliance with the French. Yet a plot presently came to light by which the Foxes, Mascoutins, and Kickapoos were to join hands, renounce the French, and cast their fortunes with the Iroquois and the English. There was still more anxiety for the tribes of Michilimackinac, because the results of their defection would be more immediate. This important post had at the time an Indian population of 6,000 or 7,000 souls, a Jesuit mission, a fort with 200 soldiers, and a village of about 60 houses, occupied by traders and coureurs de bois. The Indians of the place were in relations more or less close with all the tribes of the lakes. The Huron village was divided between two rival chiefs, the Baron, who was deep in Iroquois and English intrigue, and the Rat, who, though once the worst enemy of the French, now stood their friend. The Ottawas and other Algonquins of the adjacent villages were savages of a lower grade, tossed continually between hatred of the Iroquois, distrust of the French, and love of English goods and English rum. Lamotte Cadillac found that the Hurons of the Baron's band were receiving messengers and peace belts from New York and her red allies, that the English had promised to build a trading house on Lake Erie, and that the Iroquois had invited the lake tribes to a grand convention at Detroit. These belts and messages were sent in the Indian expression underground, that is, secretly, and the envoys who brought them came in the disguise of prisoners taken by the Hurons. On one occasion 7 Iroquois were brought in, and some of the French, suspecting them to be agents of the negotiation, stabbed 2 of them as they landed. There was a great tumult. The Hurons took arms to defend the remaining 5, but at length suffered themselves to be appeased, and even gave one of the Iroquois, a chief, into the hands of the French, who, says La Poterie, determined to make an example of him. They invited the Ottawas to drink the broth of an Iroquois. The wretch was made fast to a stake, and a Frenchman began the torture by burning him with a red-hot gun-barrel. The mob of savages was soon wrought up to the required pitch of ferocity, and after atrociously tormenting him they cut him to pieces and ate him. It was clear that the more Iroquois the allies of France could be persuaded to burn, the less would be the danger that they would make peace with the Confederacy. On another occasion 4 were tortured at once, and Lamotte Cadillac writes, "If any more prisoners are brought me, I promise you that their fate will be no sweeter." The same cruel measures were practiced when the Ottawas came to trade at Montreal. Frontenac once invited a band of them to roast an Iroquois, newly caught by the soldiers, but as they had hamstrung him to prevent his escape, he bled to death before the torture began. In the next spring, the revolting tragedy of Michilimackinac was repeated at Montreal, where 4 more Iroquois were burned by the soldiers, inhabitants, and Indian allies. "It was the mission of Canada," says a Canadian writer, "to propagate Christianity and civilization." Every effort was vain. Lamotte Cadillac wrote that matters grew worse and worse, and that the Ottawas had been made to believe that the French neither would nor could protect them, but meant to leave them to their fate. They thought that they had no hope except in peace with the Iroquois, and had actually gone to meet them at an appointed rendezvous. Of course, alone was now left to Frontenac, and this was to strike the Iroquois with a blow heavy enough to humble them, and teach the wavering hordes of the West that he was in truth their father and their defender. Nobody knew so well as he the difficulties of the attempt, and deceived perhaps by his own energy, he feared that, in his absence on a distant expedition, the governor of New York would attack Montreal. Therefore he had begged for more troops. About 300 were sent him, and with these he was forced to content himself. He had waited also for another reason. In his belief, the re-establishment of Fort Frontenac, abandoned in a panic by de Nonville, was necessary to the success of a campaign against the Iroquois. A party in the colony vehemently opposed the measure, on the ground that the fort would be used by the friends of Frontenac for purposes of trade. It was, nevertheless, very important, if not essential, for holding the Iroquois in check. They themselves felt it to be so, and when they heard that the French intended to occupy it again, they appealed to the governor of New York, who told them that, if the plan were carried into effect, he would march to their aid with all the power of his government. He did not, and perhaps could not, keep his word. In the question of Fort Frontenac, as in everything else, the opposition to the governor, always busy and vehement, found its chief representative in the Intendant, who told the minister that the policy of Frontenac was all wrong; that the public good was not its object; that he disobeyed or evaded the orders of the King; and that he had suffered the Iroquois to delude him by false overtures of peace. The representations of the Intendant and his faction had such effect, that Pontchartrain wrote to the governor that the plan of re-establishing Fort Frontenac must absolutely be abandoned. Frontenac, bent on accomplishing his purpose, and doubly so because his enemies opposed it, had anticipated the orders of the minister, and sent 700 men to Lake Ontario to repair the fort. The day after they left Montreal the letter of Pontchartrain arrived. The Intendant demanded their recall. Frontenac refused. The fort was repaired, garrisoned, and victualled for a year. A successful campaign was now doubly necessary to the governor, for by this alone could he hope to avert the consequences of his audacity. He waited no longer, but mustered troops, militia, and Indians, and marched to attack the Iroquois. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of France and England in North America, Part 5. Count Frontenac, New France, Louis XIV, by Francis Parkman, Jr. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19. 1696 to 1698. Frontenac attacks the Onondagas. On the 4th of July, Frontenac left Montreal at the head of about 2,200 men. On the 19th he reached Fort Frontenac, and on the 26th he crossed to the southern shore of Lake Ontario. A swarm of Indian canoes led the way; next followed 2 battalions of regulars in bateaux, commanded by Callieres; then more bateaux laden with cannon, mortars, and rockets; then Frontenac himself, surrounded by the canoes of his staff and his guard; then 800 Canadians under Ramsay; while more regulars and more Indians, all commanded by Vaudreuil, brought up the rear. In 2 days they reached the mouth of the Oswego; strong scouting parties were sent out to scour the forests in front, while the expedition slowly and painfully worked its way up the stream. Most of the troops and Canadians marched through the matted woods along the banks, while the bateaux and canoes were pushed, rowed, paddled, or dragged forward against the current. On the evening of the 30th they reached the falls, where the river plunged over ledges of rock which completely stopped the way. The work of "carrying" was begun at once. The Indians and Canadians carried the canoes to the navigable water above, and gangs of men dragged the bateaux up the portage path on rollers. Night soon came, and the work was continued till 10 o'clock by torchlight. Frontenac would have passed on foot like the rest, but the Indians would not have it so. They lifted him in his canoe upon their shoulders, and bore him in triumph, singing and yelling, through the forest and along the margin of the rapids, the blaze of the torches lighting the strange procession, where plumes of officers and uniforms of the governor's guard mingled with the feathers and scalp locks of naked savages. When the falls were passed, the troops pushed on as before along the narrow stream, and through the tangled labyrinths on either side, till on the 1st of August they reached Lake Onondaga, and with sails set, the whole flotilla glided before the wind, and landed the motley army on a rising ground half a league from the salt springs of Salina. The next day was spent in building a fort to protect their canoes, bateaux, and stores; and as evening closed, a ruddy glow above the southern forest told them that the town of Onondaga was on fire. The Marquis de Crisacy was left with a detachment to hold the fort; and at sunrise on the 4th the army moved forward in order of battle. It was formed in 2 lines, regulars on the right and left, and Canadians in the centre. Callieres commanded the first line, and Vaudreuil the second. Frontenac was between them, surrounded by his staff officers and his guard, and followed by the artillery, which relays of Canadians dragged and lifted forward with inconceivable labor. The governor, enfeebled by age, was carried in an armchair, while Callieres, disabled by gout, was mounted on a horse brought for the purpose in one of the bateaux. To Subercasse fell the hard task of directing the march among the dense columns of the primeval forest, by hill and hollow, over rocks and fallen trees, through swamps, brooks, and gullies, among thickets, brambles, and vines. It was but 8 or 9 miles to Onondaga, but they were all day in reaching it, and evening was near when they emerged from the shadows of the forest into the broad light of the Indian clearing. The maize fields stretched before them for miles, and in the midst lay the charred and smoking ruins of the Iroquois capital. Not an enemy was to be seen, but they found the dead bodies of 2 murdered French prisoners. Scouts were sent out, guards were set, and the disappointed troops encamped on the maize fields. Onondaga, formerly an open town, had been fortified by the English, who had enclosed it with a double range of strong palisades, forming a rectangle, flanked by bastions at the 4 corners, and surrounded by an outer fence of tall poles. The place was not defensible against cannon and mortars, and the 400 warriors belonging to it had been but slightly reinforced from the other tribes of the Confederacy, each of which feared that the French attack might be directed against itself. On the approach of an enemy of 5 times their number, they had burned their town, and retreated southward into distant forests. The troops were busied for 2 days in hacking down the maize, digging up the cache, or hidden stores of food, and destroying their contents. The neighboring tribe of the Oneidas sent a messenger to beg peace. Frontenac replied that he would grant it on condition that they all should migrate to Canada and settle there, and Vaudreuil, with 700 men, was sent to enforce the demand. Meanwhile, a few Onondaga stragglers had been found, and among them, hidden in a hollow tree, a withered warrior, 80 years old and nearly blind. Frontenac would have spared him, but the Indian allies, Christians from the mission villages, were so eager to burn him that it was thought inexpedient to refuse them. They tied him to the stake, and tried to shake his constancy by every torture that fire could inflict, but not a cry nor a murmur escaped him. He defied them to do their worst, till, enraged at his taunts, one of them gave him a mortal stab. "I thank you," said the old stoic, with his last breath, "but you ought to have finished as you began, and killed me by fire. Learn from me, you dogs of Frenchmen, how to endure pain. And you, dogs of dogs, their Indian allies, think what you will do when you are burned like me." Vaudreuil and his detachment returned within 3 days, after destroying Oneida with all the growing corn, and seizing a number of chiefs as hostages for the fulfillment of the demands of Frontenac. There was some thought of marching on Cayuga, but the governor judged it to be inexpedient, and as it would be useless to chase the fugitive Onondagas, nothing remained but to return home. While Frontenac was on his march, Governor Fletcher had heard of his approach, and called a council at New York to consider what should be done. They resolved that it will be very grievous to take the people from their labor, and there is likewise no money to answer the charge thereof. Money was, however, advanced by Colonel Cortland and others, and the governor wrote to Connecticut and New Jersey for their contingents of men, but they thought the matter no concern of theirs, and did not respond. Fletcher went to Albany with the few men he could gather at the moment, and heard on his arrival that the French were gone. Then he convoked the chiefs, condoled with them, and made them presents. Corn was sent to the Onondagas and Oneidas to support them through the winter, and prevent the famine which the French hoped would prove their destruction. What Frontenac feared had come to pass. The enemy had saved themselves by flight, and his expedition, like that of Denonville, was but half successful. He took care, however, to announce it to the King as a triumph. "Sire, the benedictions which Heaven has ever showered upon your Majesty's arms have extended even to this New World, whereof we have had visible proof in the expedition I have just made against the Onondagas, the principal nation of the Iroquois. I had long projected this enterprise, but the difficulties and risks which attended it made me regard it as imprudent, and I should never have resolved to undertake it if I had not last year established an entrepot Fort Frontenac, which made my communications more easy, and if I had not known, beyond all doubt, that this was absolutely the only means to prevent our allies from making peace with the Iroquois, and introducing the English into their country, by which the colony would infallibly be ruined. Nevertheless, by unexpected good fortune, the Onondagas, who passed for masters of the other Iroquois, and the terror of all the Indians of this country, fell into a sort of bewilderment which could only have come from on high, and were so terrified to see me march against them in person, and cover their lakes and rivers with nearly 400 sail, that without availing themselves of passes where 100 men might easily hold 4,000 in check, they did not dare to lay a single ambuscade, but after waiting till I was 5 leagues from their fort, they set it on fire with all their dwellings, and fled with their families 20 leagues into the depths of the forest. It could have been wished to make the affair more brilliant, for they had tried to hold their fort against us, for we were prepared to force it and kill a great many of them; but their ruin is not the less sure, because the famine to which they are reduced will destroy more than we could have killed by sword and gun. All the officers and men have done their duty admirably, and especially Monsieur de Calière, who has been a great help to me. I know not if your Majesty will think that I have tried to do mine, and will hold me worthy of some mark of honor that may enable me to pass the short remainder of my life in some little distinction; but whether this be so or not, I most humbly pray your Majesty to believe that I will sacrifice the rest of my days to your Majesty's service with the same ardor I have always felt." The King highly commended him, and sent him the cross of the Military Order of St. Louis. Calière, who had deserved it less, had received it several years before, but he had not found or provoked so many defamers. Frontenac complained to the Minister that his services had been slightly and tardily requited. This was true, and it was due largely to the complaints excited by his own perversity and violence. These complaints still continued, but the fault was not all on one side, and Frontenac himself had often just reason to retort them. He wrote to Pontchartrain: "If you will not be so good as to look closely into the true state of things here, I shall always be exposed to detraction, and forced to make new apologies, which is very hard for a person so full of zeal and uprightness as I am. My secretary, who is going to France, will tell you all the ugly intrigues used to defeat my plans for the service of the King and the growth of the colony. I have long tried to combat these artifices, but I confess that I no longer feel strength to resist them, and must succumb at last, if you will not have the goodness to give me strong support." He still continued to provoke the detraction which he deprecated, till he drew at last a sharp remonstrance from the Minister. "The dispute you have had with Monsieur de Champigny is without cause, and I confess I cannot comprehend how you could have acted as you have done. If you do things of this sort, you must expect disagreeable consequences, which all the desire I have to oblige you cannot prevent. It is deplorable, both for you and for me, that instead of using my good will to gain favors from his Majesty, you compel me to make excuses for a violence which answers no purpose, and in which you indulge wantonly, nobody can tell why." Most of these quarrels, however trivial in themselves, had a solid foundation, and were closely connected with the great question of the control of the West. As to the measures to be taken, 2 parties divided the colony; one consisting of the governor and his friends, and the other of the Intendant, the Jesuits, and such of the merchants as were not in favor with Frontenac. His policy was to protect the Indian allies at all risks, to repel by force, if necessary, every attempt of the English to encroach on the territory in dispute, and to occupy it by force, which should be at once posts of war and commerce, and places of rendezvous for traders and voyageurs. Champigny and his party denounced this system, urged that the forest posts should be abandoned, that both garrisons and traders should be recalled, that the French should not go to the Indians, but that the Indians should come to the French, that the fur trade of the interior should be carried on at Montreal, and that no Frenchman should be allowed to leave the settled limits of the colony, except the Jesuits and persons in their service, who, as Champigny insisted, would be able to keep the Indians in the French interest without the help of soldiers. Strong personal interests were active on both sides, and gave bitterness to the strife. Frontenac, who always stood by his friends, had placed Tonty, La Forêt, Lamotte Cadillac, and others of their number, in charge of the forest posts, where they made good profit by trade. Moreover, the licenses for trading expeditions into the interior were now, as before, used largely for the benefit of his favorites. The Jesuits also declared, and with some truth, that the forest posts were centres of debauchery, and that the licenses for the western trade were the ruin of innumerable young men. All these reasons were laid before the King. In vain Frontenac represented that to abandon the forest posts would be to resign to the English the trade of the interior country, and at last the country itself. The royal ear was open to his opponents, and the royal instincts reinforced their arguments. The King, enamoured of subordination and order, wished to govern Canada as he governed a province of France, and this could be done only by keeping the population within prescribed bounds. Therefore he commanded that licenses for the forest trade should cease, that the forest posts should be abandoned and destroyed, that all Frenchmen should be ordered back to the settlements, and that none should return under pain of the galleys. An exception was made in favor of the Jesuits, who were allowed to continue their western missions, subject to restrictions designed to prevent them from becoming a cover to illicit fur trade. Frontenac was also directed to make peace with the Iroquois, even if necessary, without including the western allies of France; that is, he was authorized by Louis XIV. To pursue the course which had discredited and imperilled the colony under the rule of Denonville. The intentions of the King did not take effect. The policy of Frontenac was the true one, whatever motives may have entered into his advocacy of it. In view of the geographical, social, political, and commercial conditions of Canada, the policy of his opponents was impracticable, and nothing less than a perpetual cordon of troops could have prevented the Canadians from escaping to the backwoods. In spite of all the evils that attended the forest posts, it would have been a blunder to abandon them. This quickly became apparent. Champigny himself saw the necessity of compromise. The instructions of the King were scarcely given before they were partially withdrawn, and they soon became a dead letter. Even Fort Frontenac was retained after repeated directions to abandon it. The policy of the governor prevailed; the colony returned to its normal methods of growth, and so continued to the end. Now came the question of peace with the Iroquois, to whose mercy Frontenac was authorized to leave his western allies. He was the last man to accept such permission. Since the burning of Onondaga, the Iroquois negotiations with the western tribes had been broken off, and several fights had occurred, in which the Confederates had suffered loss and been roused to vengeance. This was what Frontenac wanted, but at the same time it promised him fresh trouble; for while he was determined to prevent the Iroquois from making peace with the allies without his authority, he was equally determined to compel them to do so with it. There must be peace, though not till he could control its conditions. The Onondaga campaign, unsatisfactory as it was, had had its effect. Several Iroquois chiefs came to Quebec with overtures of peace. They brought no prisoners, but promised to bring them in the spring, and one of them remained as a hostage that a promise should be kept. It was nevertheless broken under English influence, and instead of a solemn embassy, the Council of Onondaga sent a messenger with a wampum belt to tell Frontenac that they were all so engrossed in bewailing the recent death of Black Kettle, a famous war chief, that they had no strength to travel, and they begged that Ononcio would return the hostage, and send to them for the French prisoners. The messenger farther declared that, though they would make peace with Ononcio, they would not make it with his allies. Frontenac threw back the peace belt into his face. "Tell the chiefs that if they must needs stay at home to cry about a trifle, I will give them something to cry for. Let them bring me every prisoner, French and Indian, and make a treaty that shall include all my children, or they shall feel my tomahawk again." Then, turning to a number of Ottawas who were present, "You see that I can make peace for myself when I please. If I continue the war, it is only for your sake. I will never make a treaty without including you, and recovering your prisoners like my own." Thus the matter stood, when a great event took place. Early in February, a party of Dutch and Indians came to Montreal with news that peace had been signed in Europe; and at the end of May, Major Peter Schuyler, accompanied by Delius, the minister of Albany, arrived with copies of the treaty in French and Latin. The scratch of a pen at Ryswick had ended the conflict in America, so far at least as concerned the civilized combatants. It was not till July that Frontenac received the official announcement from Versailles, coupled with an address from the King to the people of Canada. "Our faithful and beloved, the moment has arrived ordained by Heaven to reconcile the nations. The ratification of the treaty concluded some time ago by our ambassadors with those of the Emperor and the Empire, after having made peace with Spain, England, and Holland, has everywhere restored the tranquillity so much desired. Strasbourg, one of the chief ramparts of the empire of heresy, united forever to the Church and to our crown; the Rhine established as the barrier between France and Germany; and what touches us even more, the worship of the true faith authorized by a solemn engagement with sovereigns of another religion, are the advantages secured by this last treaty. The author of so many blessings manifests himself so clearly that we cannot but recognize his goodness; and the visible impress of his all-powerful hand is as it were the seal he has affixed to justify our intent to cause all our realm to serve and obey him, and to make our people happy. We have begun by the fulfillment of our duty in offering him the thanks which are his due; and we have ordered the archbishops and bishops of our kingdom to cause Te Deum to be sung in the cathedrals of their dioceses. It is our will and our command that you be present at that which will be sung in the cathedral of our city of Quebec, on the day appointed by the Count of Frontenac, our Governor and Lieutenant General in New France. Herein fail not, for such is our pleasure. Louis. There was peace between the two crowns; but a serious question still remained between Frontenac and the new governor of New York, the Earl of Belmont. When Schuyler and Delius came to Quebec, they brought with them all the French prisoners in the hands of the English of New York, together with a promise from Belmont that he would order the Iroquois, subjects of the British crown, to deliver to him all those in their possession, and that he would send them to Canada under a safe escort. The two envoys demanded of Frontenac, at the same time, that he should deliver to them all the Iroquois in his hands. To give up Iroquois prisoners to Belmont, or to receive through him French prisoners whom the Iroquois had captured, would have been an acknowledgment of British sovereignty over the 5 Confederate tribes. Frontenac replied that the Earl need give himself no trouble in the matter, as the Iroquois were rebellious subjects of King Louis; that they had already repented and begged peace; and that, if they did not soon come to conclude it, he should use force to compel them. Belmont wrote in return that he had sent arms to the Iroquois with orders to defend themselves if attacked by the French, and to give no quarter to them or their allies; and he added that if necessary he would send soldiers to their aid. A few days after he received fresh news of Frontenac's warlike intentions, and wrote in wrath as follows: "Sir, 2 of our Indians of the nation called Onondagas came yesterday to advise me that you had sent 2 renegades of their nation to them, to tell them and the other tribes, except the Mohawks, that, in case they did not come to Canada within 40 days to solicit peace from you, they may expect your marching into their country at the head of an army to constrain them thereunto by force. I, on my side, do this very day send my lieutenant governor with the king's troops to join the Indians, and to oppose any hostilities you will attempt; and if needs be, I will arm every man in the provinces under my government to repel you, and to make reprisals for the damage you will commit on our Indians. This in a few words is the part I will take, and the resolution I have adopted, whereof I have thought it proper by these presents to give you notice. I am, sir, yours, etc., etc., Earl of Belmont, New York, 22nd August, 1698. To arm every man in his government would have been difficult. He did, however, what he could, and ordered Captain Nanfan, the lieutenant governor, to repair to Albany, whence, on the first news that the French were approaching, he was to march to the relief of the Iroquois with the 4 shattered companies of regulars, and as many of the militia of Albany and Ulster as he could muster. Then the Earl sent Vessels, Mayor of Albany, to persuade the Iroquois to deliver their prisoners to him, and make no treaty with Frontenac. On the same day he dispatched Captain John Schuyler to carry his letters to the French governor. When Schuyler reached Quebec and delivered the letters, Frontenac read them with marks of great displeasure. "My Lord Belmont threatens me," he said. "Does he think that I am afraid of him? He claims the Iroquois, but they are none of his. They call me father, and they call him brother; and shall not a father chastise his children when he sees fit?" A conversation followed in which Frontenac asked the envoy what was the strength of Belmont's government. Schuyler parried the question by a grotesque exaggeration, and answered that the Earl could bring about 100,000 men into the field. Frontenac pretended to believe him, and returned with careless gravity that he had always heard so. The following Sunday was the day appointed for the Te Deum ordered by the King, and all the dignitaries of the colony, with a crowd of lesser note, filled the cathedral. There was a dinner of ceremony at the Chateau, to which Schuyler was invited, and he found the table of the governor thronged with officers. Frontenac called on his guests to drink the health of King William. Schuyler replied by a toast in honor of King Louis; and the governor next gave the health of the Earl of Belmont. The peace was then solemnly proclaimed amid the firing of cannon from the batteries and ships, and the day closed with a bonfire and a general illumination. On the next evening Frontenac gave Schuyler a letter in answer to the threats of the Earl. He had written with trembling hand, but unshaken will and unbending pride: "I am determined to pursue my course without flinching, and I request you not try to thwart me by efforts which will prove useless. All the protection and aid you tell me that you have given, and will continue to give the Iroquois against the terms of the treaty, will not cause me much alarm, nor make me change my plans, but rather, on the contrary, engage me to pursue them still more." As the old soldier traced these lines, the shadow of death was upon him. Toils and years, passions and cares, had wasted his strength at last, and his fiery soul could bear him up no longer. A few weeks later he was lying calmly on his death bed. Chapter 20 and 21 of France and England in North America, Part 5, Count Frontenac, New France, Louis XIV, by Francis Parkman, Jr. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 20, 1698. Death of Frontenac. In November, when the last ship had gone and Canada was sealed from the world for half a year, a mortal illness fell upon the governor. On the 22nd he had strength enough to dictate his will, seated in an easy chair in his chamber at the Chateau. His colleague and adversary Champigny often came to visit him, and did all in his power to soothe his last moments. The reconciliation between them was complete. One of his Récollet friends, Father Olivier Goyer, administered extreme unction, and on the afternoon of the 28th he died in perfect composure and full possession of his faculties. He was in his 78th year. He was greatly beloved by the humbler classes, who days before his death beset the Chateau praising and lamenting him. Many of higher station shared the popular grief. "He was the love and delight of New France," says one of them. "Churchmen honored him for his piety, nobles esteemed him for his valor, merchants respected him for his equity, and the people loved him for his kindness. He was the father of the poor," says another, "the protector of the oppressed, and a perfect model of virtue and piety. An Ursuline nun regrets him as the friend and patron of her sisterhood, and so also does the superior of the Hôtel Dieu." His most conspicuous, though not his bitterest opponent, the Intendant Champigny, thus announced his death to the court: "I venture to send this letter by way of New England to tell you that Monsieur le Comte de Frontenac died on the 28th of last month, with the sentiments of a true Christian. After all the disputes we have had together, you will hardly believe, Monseigneur, how truly and deeply I am touched by his death. He treated me during his illness in a manner so obliging, that I should be utterly void of gratitude if I did not feel thankful to him." As a mark of kind feeling, Frontenac had bequeathed to the Intendant a valuable crucifix, and to Madame de Champigny a reliquary which he had long been accustomed to wear. For the rest, he gave 1,500 livres to the Récollets, to be expended in masses for his soul and that of his wife after her death. To her he bequeathed all the remainder of his small property, and he also directed that his heart should be sent her in a case of lead or silver. His enemies reported that she refused to accept it, saying that she had never had it when he was living, and did not want it when he was dead. On the Friday after his death he was buried as he had directed, not in the cathedral, but in the church of the Récollets, a preference deeply offensive to many of the clergy. The bishop officiated, and then the Récollet, Father Goyer, who had attended his death bed and seems to have been his confessor, mounted the pulpit and delivered his funeral oration. "This funeral pageantry," exclaimed the orator, "this temple draped in mourning, these dim lights, this sad and solemn music, this great assembly bowed in sorrow, and all this pomp and circumstance of death may well penetrate your hearts. I will not seek to dry your tears, for I cannot contain my own. After all, this is a time to weep, and never did people weep for a better governor." A copy of this eulogy fell into the hands of an enemy of Frontenac, who wrote a running commentary upon it. The copy thus annotated is still preserved at Quebec. A few passages from the orator and his critic will show the violent conflict of opinion concerning the governor, and illustrate in some sort, though with more force than fairness, the contradictions of his character. The orator: "This wise man, to whom the Senate of Venice listened with respectful attention because he spoke before them with all the force of that eloquence which you, messieurs, have so often admired." The critic: "It was not his eloquence that they admired, but his extravagant pretensions, his bursts of rage, and his unworthy treatment of those who did not agree with him." The orator: "This disinterested man, more busied with duty than with gain." The critic: "The less said about that, the better." The orator: "Who made the fortune of others, but did not increase his own." The critic: "Not for want of trying, and that very often in spite of his conscience and the king's orders." The orator: "Devoted to the service of his king, whose majesty he represented and whose person he loved." The critic: "Not at all. How often has he opposed his orders, even with force and violence, to the great scandal of everybody." The orator: "Great in the midst of difficulties by that consummate prudence, that solid judgment, that presence of mind, that breadth and elevation of thought which he retained to the last moment of his life." The critic: "He had, in fact, a great capacity for political manoeuvres and tricks; but as for the solid judgment ascribed to him, his conduct gives it the lie, or else, if he had it, the vehemence of his passions often unsettled it. It is much to be feared that his presence of mind was the effect of an obstinate and hardened self confidence, by which he put himself above everybody and everything, since he never used it to repair, so far as in him lay, the public and private wrongs he caused. What ought he not to have done here, in this temple, to ask pardon for the obstinate and furious heat with which he so long persecuted the Church, upheld and even instigated rebellion against her, protected libertines, scandal mongers, and creatures of evil life against the ministers of heaven, molested, persecuted, vexed persons most eminent in virtue, nay, even the priests and magistrates who defended the cause of God, sustained in all sorts of ways the wrongful and scandalous traffic in brandy with the Indians, permitted, approved, and supported the license and abuse of taverns, authorized and even introduced, in spite of the remonstrances of the servants of God, criminal and dangerous diversions, tried to decry the bishop and the clergy, the missionaries, and other persons of virtue, and to injure them, both here and in France, by libels and calumnies, caused, in fine, either by himself or through others, a multitude of disorders under which this infant Church has groaned for many years. What, I say, ought he not to have done before dying to atone for these scandals, and give proof of sincere penitence and compunction? God gave him full time to recognize his errors, and yet to the last he showed a great indifference in all these matters. When in presence of the Holy Sacrament he was asked, according to the ritual, "Do you not beg pardon for all the ill examples you may have given?" he answered, "Yes," but did not confess that he had ever given any. In a word, he behaved during the few days before his death like one who had led an irreproachable life and had nothing to fear. And this is the presence of mind that he retained to his last moment. The orator: "Great in dangers by his courage, he always came off with honor and never was reproached with rashness." The critic: "True. He was not rash, as was seen when the Bostonnais besieged Quebec." The orator: "Great in religion by his piety, he practiced its good works in spirit and in truth." The critic: "Say rather that he practiced its forms with parade and ostentation. Witness the inordinate ambition with which he always claimed honors in the Church, to which he had no right, outrageously affronted intendants, who opposed his pretensions, required priests to address him when preaching, and in their intercourse with him demanded from them humiliations which he did not exact from the meanest military officer. This was his way of making himself great in religion and piety, or more truly, in vanity and hypocrisy. How can a man be called great in religion when he openly holds opinions entirely opposed to the true faith, such as that all men are predestined, that hell will not last forever, and the like? The orator. His very look inspired esteem and confidence. The critic. Then one must have taken him at exactly the right moment, and not when he was foaming at the mouth with rage. The orator. A mingled air of nobility and gentleness, a countenance that bespoke the probity that appeared in all his acts, and a sincerity that could not dissimulate. The critic. The eulogist did not know the old fox. The orator. An inviolable fidelity to friends. The critic. What friends? Was it persons of the other sex? Of these he was always fond, and too much for the honor of some of them. The orator. Disinterested for himself, ardent for others, he used his credit at court only to recommend their services, excuse their faults, and obtain favors for them. The critic. True, but it was for his creatures and for nobody else. The orator. I pass in silence that reading of spiritual books which he practiced as an indispensable duty more than 40 years, that holy avidity with which he listened to the word of God. The critic. Only if the preacher addressed the sermon to him, and called him Monseigneur. As for his reading, it was often Jansenist books, of which he had a great many, and which he greatly praised and lent freely to others. The orator. He prepared for the sacraments by meditation and retreat. The critic. And generally came out of his retreat more excited than ever against the Church. The orator. Let us not recall his ancient and noble descent, his family connected with all that is greatest in the army, the magistry, and the government. Knights, marshals of France, governors of provinces, judges, councillors, and ministers of state. Let us not, I say, recall all these without remembering that their examples roused this generous heart to noble emulation, and, as an expiring flame grows brighter as it dies, so did all the virtues of his race unite at last in him, to end with glory a long line of great men, that shall be no more except in history. The critic. Well laid on, and too well for his hearers to believe him. Far from agreeing that all these virtues were collected in the person of his pretended hero, they would find it very hard to admit that he had even one of them. It is clear enough from what quiver these arrows came. From the first, Frontenac had set himself in opposition to the most influential of the Canadian clergy. When he came to the colony, their power in the government was still enormous, and even the most devout of his predecessors had been forced into conflict with them to defend the civil authority. But when Frontenac entered the strife, he brought into it an irritability, a jealous and exacting vanity, a love of rule, and a passion for having his own way even in trifles, which made him the most exasperating of adversaries. Hence it was that many of the clerical party felt towards him a bitterness that was far from ending with his life. The sentiment of a religion often survives its convictions. However heterodox in doctrine, he was still wedded to the observances of the Church, and practiced them, under the ministration of the Récollets, with an assiduity that made full amends to his conscience for the vivacity with which he opposed the rest of the clergy. To the Récollets their patron was the most devout of men. To his ultramontane adversaries he was an impious persecutor. His own acts and words best paint his character, and it is needless to enlarge upon it. What perhaps may be least forgiven him is the barbarity of the warfare that he waged, and the cruelties that he permitted. He had seen too many towns sacked to be much subject to the scruples of modern humanitarianism. Yet he was no whit more ruthless than his times and surroundings, and some of his contemporaries find fault with him for not allowing more Indian captives to be tortured. Many surpassed him in cruelty, none equaled him in capacity and vigor. When civilized enemies were once within his power, he treated them, according to their degree, with a chivalrous courtesy or a generous kindness. If he was a hot and pertinacious foe, he was also a fast friend, and he excited love and hatred in about equal measure. His attitude towards public enemies was always proud and peremptory, yet his courage was guided by so clear a sagacity that he never was forced to recede from the position he had taken. Towards Indians he was an admirable compound of sternness and conciliation. Of the immensity of his services to the colony there can be no doubt. He found it under Denonville in humiliation and terror, and he left it in honor and almost in triumph. In spite of Father Goyer, greatness must be denied him, but a more remarkable figure in its bold and salient individuality and sharply marked light and shadow is nowhere seen in American history. Chapter 21. 1699 to 1701. Conclusion. It did not need the presence of Frontenac to cause snappings and sparks in the highly electrical atmosphere of New France. Callieres took his place as governor ad interim, and in due time received a formal appointment to the office. Apart from the wretched state of his health, undermined by gout and dropsy, he was in most respects well fitted for it, but his deportment at once gave umbrage to the excitable Champigny, who declared that he had never seen such hauteur since he came to the colony. Another official was still more offended. "Monsieur de Frontenac," he says, "was no sooner dead than trouble began. Monsieur de Callieres, puffed up by his new authority, claims honors due only to a Marshal of France. It would be a different matter if he, like his predecessor, were regarded as the father of the country, and the love and delight of the Indian allies. At the review at Montreal he sat in his carriage, and received the incense offered him with as much composure and coolness as if he had been some divinity of this new world." In spite of these complaints, the court sustained Callieres and authorized him to enjoy the honors that he had assumed. His first and chief task was to finish the work that Frontenac had shaped out, and bring the Iroquois to such submission as the interests of the colony and its allies demanded. The fierce Confederates admired the late governor, and, if they themselves are to be believed, could not help lamenting him; but they were emboldened by his death, and the difficulty of dealing with them was increased by it. Had they been sure of effectual support from the English, there can be little doubt that they would have refused to treat with the French, of whom their distrust was extreme. The treachery of Denonville at Fort Frontenac still rankled in their hearts, and the English had made them believe that some of their best men had lately been poisoned by agents from Montreal. The French assured them, on the other hand, that the English meant to poison them, refused to sell them powder and lead, and then, when they were helpless, fall upon and destroy them. At Montreal they were told that the English called them their negroes, and at Albany that if they made peace with the nuncio they would sink into perpetual infamy and slavery. Still, in spite of their perplexity, they persisted in asserting their independence of each of the rival powers, and played the one against the other in order to strengthen their position with both. When Belmont required them to surrender their French prisoners to him, they answered, "We are the masters. Our prisoners are our own. We will keep them or give them to the French if we choose." At the same time they told Callieres that they would bring them to the English at Albany, and invited him to send thither his agents to receive them. They were much disconcerted, however, when letters were read to them which showed that, pending the action of commissioners to settle the dispute, the two kings had ordered their respective governors to refrain from all acts of hostility and join forces, if necessary, to compel the Iroquois to keep quiet. This, with their enormous losses, and their desire to recover their people held captive in Canada, led them at last to serious thoughts of peace. Resolving at the same time to try the temper of the new nuncio, and yield no more than was absolutely necessary, they sent him but 6 ambassadors and no prisoners. The ambassadors marched in single file to the place of council, while their chief, who led the way, sang a dismal song of lamentation for the French slain in the war, calling on them to thrust their heads above ground, behold the good work of peace, and banish every thought of vengeance. Callieres proved, as they had hoped, less inexorable than Frontenac. He accepted their promises, and consented to send for the prisoners in their hands, on condition that within 36 days a full deputation of their principal men should come to Montreal. The Jesuit Brouillat, the Canadian Maricourt, and a French officer named Joncaire went back with them to receive the prisoners. The history of Joncaire was a noteworthy one. The Senecas had captured him some time before, tortured his companions to death, and doomed him to the same fate. As a preliminary torment, an old chief tried to burn a finger of the captive in the bowl of his pipe, on which Joncaire knocked him down. If he had begged for mercy, their hearts would have been flint, but the warrior crowd was so pleased with this proof of courage that they adopted him as one of their tribe, and gave him an Iroquois wife. He lived among them for many years, and gained a commanding influence which proved very useful to the French. When he with Bruyas and Maricourt approached Onondaga, which had long before risen from its ashes, they were greeted with a fusillade of joy, and regaled with the sweet stalks of young maize, followed by the more substantial refreshment of venison and corn beaten together into a pulp and boiled. The chiefs and elders seemed well inclined to peace, and though an envoy came from Albany to prevent it, he behaved with such arrogance that, far from dissuading his auditors, he confirmed them in their resolve to meet a nuncio at Montreal. They seemed willing enough to give up their French prisoners, but an unexpected difficulty arose from the prisoners themselves. They had been adopted into Iroquois families, and having become attached to the Indian life, they would not leave it. Some of them hid in the woods to escape their deliverers, who, with their best efforts, could collect but 13, all women, children, and boys. With these they returned to Montreal, accompanied by a peace embassy of 19 Iroquois. Peace then was made. "I bury the hatchet," said Callieres, "in a deep hole, and over the hole I place a great rock, and over the rock I turn a river, that the hatchet may never be dug up again." The famous Huron, Kondiaronk, or the Rat, was present, as were also a few Ottawas, Abenakis, and converts of the Sault and the Mountain. Sharp words passed between them and the ambassadors; but at last they all laid down their hatchets at the feet of a nuncio, and signed the treaty together. It was but a truce, and a doubtful one. More was needed to confirm it, and the following August was named for a solemn act of ratification. Father Enjolras was sent to Michilimackinac, while Courtemanche spent the winter and spring in toilsome journeyings among the tribes of the West. Such was his influence over them that he persuaded them all to give up their Iroquois prisoners, and send deputies to the Grand Council. Enjolras had had scarcely less success among the northern tribes, and early in July a great fleet of canoes, conducted by Courtemanche, and filled with chiefs, warriors, and Iroquois prisoners, paddled down the lakes for Montreal. Meanwhile, Bruyas, Maricourt, and Joncaire had returned on the same errand to the Iroquois towns; but so far as concerned prisoners, their success was no greater than before. Whether French or Indian, the chiefs were slow to give them up, saying that they had all been adopted into families who would not part with them unless consoled for the loss by gifts. This was true, but it was equally true of the other tribes, whose chiefs had made the necessary gifts, and recovered the captive Iroquois. Joncaire and his colleagues succeeded, however, in leading a large deputation of chiefs and elders to Montreal. Courtemanche, with his canoe fleet from the lakes, was not far behind; and when their approach was announced, the chronicler, La Poterie, full of curiosity, went to meet them at the mission village of the Sault. First appeared the Iroquois, 200 in all, firing their guns as their canoes drew near, while the mission Indians, ranged along the shore, returned the salute. The ambassadors were conducted to a capacious lodge, where for a quarter of an hour they sat smoking with immovable composure. Then a chief of the mission made a speech, and then followed a feast of boiled dogs. In the morning they descended the rapids to Montreal, and in due time the distant roar of the saluting cannon told of their arrival. They had scarcely left the village when the river was covered with the canoes of the western and northern allies. There was another fusillade of welcome as the heterogeneous company landed and marched to the great council house. The calumet was produced, and 12 of the assembled chiefs sang a song, each rattling at the same time a dried gourd half full of peas. 6 large kettles were next brought in, containing several dogs, and a bear suitably chopped to pieces, which, being ladled out to the guests, were dispatched in an instant, and a solemn dance and a supper of boiled corn closed the festivity. The strangers embarked again on the next day, and the cannon of Montreal greeted them as they landed before the town. A great quantity of evergreen boughs had been gathered for their use, and of these they made their wigwams outside the palisades. Before the opening of the Grand Council, a multitude of questions must be settled, jealousies soothed, and complaints answered. Callieres had no peace. He was busied for a week in giving audience to the deputies. There was one question which agitated them all, and threatened to rekindle the war. Kondiaronk, the Rat, the foremost man among all the allied tribes, gave utterance to the general feeling. "My father, you told us last autumn to bring you all the Iroquois prisoners in our hands. We have obeyed and brought them. Now let us see if the Iroquois also have obeyed, and brought you our people whom they captured during the war. If they have done so, they are sincere; if not, they are false. But I know that they have not brought them. I told you last year that it was better that they should bring their prisoners first. You see now how it is, and how they have deceived us." The complaint was just, and the situation became critical. The Iroquois deputies were invited to explain themselves. They stalked into the council room with their usual haughty composure, and readily promised to surrender the prisoners in future, but offered no hostages for their good faith. The Rat, who had counseled his own and other tribes to bring their Iroquois captives to Montreal, was excessively mortified at finding himself duped. He came to a later meeting, when this and other matters were to be discussed, but he was so weakened by fever that he could not stand. An armchair was brought him, and seated in it he harangued the Assembly for 2 hours amid a deep silence, broken only by ejaculations of approval from his Indian hearers. When the meeting ended he was completely exhausted, and being carried in his chair to the hospital, he died about midnight. He was a great loss to the French, for though he had caused the massacre of Lachine, his services of late had been invaluable. In spite of his unlucky name, he was one of the ablest North American Indians on record, as appears by his remarkable influence over many tribes, and by the respect, not to say admiration, of his French contemporaries. The French charged themselves with the funeral rites, carried the dead chief to his wigwam, stretched him on a robe of beaver skin, and left him there lying in state, swathed in a scarlet blanket, with a kettle, a gun, and a sword at his side for his use in the world of spirits. This was a concession to the superstition of his countrymen, for the Rat was a convert and went regularly to mass. Even the Iroquois, his deadliest foes, paid tribute to his memory. 60 of them came in solemn procession and ranged themselves around the bier, while one of their principal chiefs pronounced an harangue in which he declared that the sun had covered his face that day in grief for the loss of the great Huron. He was buried on the next morning. Saint-Ours, senior captain, led the funeral train with an escort of troops, followed by 16 Huron warriors in robes of beaver skin, marching 4 and 4, with faces painted black and guns reversed. Then came the clergy, and then 6 war chiefs carrying the coffin. It was decorated with flowers, and on it lay a plumed hat, a sword, and a gorget. Behind it were the brother and sons of the dead chief, and files of Huron and Ottawa warriors, while Madame de Champigny, attended by Vaudreuil and all the military officers, closed the procession. After the service, the soldiers fired 3 volleys over the grave, and a tablet was placed upon it, carved with the words, Sigit le Rat, chef des Hurons. All this ceremony pleased the allied tribes, and helped to calm their irritation. Every obstacle being at length removed or smoothed over, the 4th of August was named for the Grand Council. A vast oblong space was marked out on a plain near the town, and enclosed with a fence of branches. At one end was a canopy of boughs and leaves, under which were seats for the spectators. Troops were drawn up in line along the sides. The seats under the canopy were filled by ladies, officials, and the chief inhabitants of Montreal. Callieres sat in front, surrounded by interpreters, and the Indians were seated on the grass around the open space. There were more than 1,300 of them, gathered from a distance of full 2,000 miles, Hurons and Ottawas from Michilimackinac, Ojibwas from Lake Superior, Crees from the remote north, Potawatomis from Lake Michigan, Mascoutins, Sacs, Foxes, Winnebagos, and Menemonees from Wisconsin, Miamis from the St. Joseph, Illinois from the river Illinois, Abenakis from Acadia, and many allied hordes of less account, each savage painted with divers hues and patterns, and each in his dress of ceremony, leathern shirts fringed with scalp locks, colored blankets or robes of bison hide and beaver skin, bristling crests of hair or long lank tresses, eagle feathers or horns of beasts. Preeminent among them all sat their valiant and terrible foes, the warriors of the Confederacy. Strange, exclaims La Poterie, that 4,000 or 5,000 should make a whole new world tremble. New England is but too happy to gain their good graces. New France is often wasted by their wars, and our allies dread them over an extent of more than 1,500 leagues. It was more a marvel than he knew, for he greatly overrates their number. Callieres opened the council with a speech in which he told the Assembly that, since but few tribes were represented at the treaty of the year before, he had sent for them all to ratify it; that he now threw their hatchets and his own into a pit so deep that nobody could find them; that henceforth they must live like brethren; and if by chance one should strike another, the injured brother must not revenge the blow, but come for redress to him, Annunzio, their common father. Nicholas Perrot and the Jesuits who acted as interpreters repeated the speech in 5 different languages; and, to confirm it, 31 wampum belts were given to the 31 tribes present. Then each tribe answered in turn. First came Hasaki, chief of an Ottawa band known as Cut Tails. He approached with a majestic air, his long robe of beaver skin trailing on the grass behind him. 4 Iroquois captives followed with eyes bent on the ground; and when he stopped before the governor they seated themselves at his feet. "You asked us for our prisoners," he said, "and here they are. I set them free because you wish it, and I regard them as my brothers." Then turning to the Iroquois deputies, "Know that if I pleased I might have eaten them, but I have not done as you would have done. Remember this when we meet, and let us be friends." The Iroquois ejaculated their approval. Next came a Huron chief, followed by 8 Iroquois prisoners, who, as he declared, had been bought at great cost, in kettles, guns, and blankets, from the families who had adopted them. "We thought that the Iroquois would have done by us as we have done by them, and we were astonished to see that they had not brought us our prisoners. Listen to me, my father, and you, Iroquois, listen. I am not sorry to make peace, since my father wishes it, and I will live in peace with him and with you." Thus, in turn, came the spokesmen of all the tribes, delivering their prisoners and making their speeches. The Miami orator said, "I am very angry with the Iroquois, who burned my son some years ago; but to-day I forget all that. My father's will is mine. I will not be like the Iroquois who have disobeyed his voice." The orator of the Mississaugas came forward, crowned with the head and horns of a young bison bull, and presenting his prisoners, said, "I place them in your hands. Do with them as you like. I am only too proud that you count me among your allies." The chief of the Foxes now rose from his seat at the farther end of the enclosure, and walked sedately across the whole open space towards the stand of spectators. His face was painted red, and he wore an old French wig, with its abundant curls in a state of complete entanglement. When he reached the chair of the governor he bowed, and lifted the wig like a hat, to show that he was perfect in French politeness. There was a burst of laughter from the spectators, but Callieres, with ceremonious gravity, begged him to put it on again, which he did, and proceeded with his speech, the pith of which was briefly as follows: "The darkness is gone, the sun shines bright again, and now the Iroquois is my brother." Then came a young Algonquin war chief, dressed like a Canadian, but adorned with a drooping red feather and a tall ridge of hair like the crest of a cock. It was he who slew Black Kettle, that redoubted Iroquois whose loss filled the Confederacy with mourning, and who exclaimed as he fell, "Must I, who have made the whole earth tremble, now die by the hand of a child?" The young chief spoke concisely and to the purpose. "I am not a man of counsel. It is for me to listen to your words. Peace has come, and now let us forget the past." When he and all the rest had ended, the orator of the Iroquois strode to the front, and in brief words gave in their adhesion to the treaty. "Onontio, we are pleased with all you have done, and we have listened to all you have said. We assure you by these 4 belts of wampum that we will stand fast in our obedience. As for the prisoners whom we have not brought you, we place them at your disposal, and you will send and fetch them." The calumet was lighted. Callieres, Champigny, and Vaudreuil drew the first smoke, then the Iroquois deputies, and then all the tribes in turn. The treaty was duly signed, the representative of each tribe affixing his mark, in the shape of some bird, beast, fish, reptile, insect, plant, or nondescript object. "Thus," says La Poterie, "the labors of the late Count Frontenac were brought to a happy consummation." The work of Frontenac was indeed finished, though not as he would have finished it. Callieres had told the Iroquois that till they surrendered their Indian prisoners he would keep in his own hands the Iroquois prisoners surrendered by the allied tribes. To this the spokesman of the Confederacy coolly replied, "Such a proposal was never made since the world began. Keep them if you like. We will go home and think no more about them. But if you gave them to us without making trouble, and gave us our son Joncaire at the same time, we should have no reason to distrust your sincerity, and should all be glad to send you back the prisoners we took from your allies." Callieres yielded, persuaded the allies to agree to the conditions, gave up the prisoners, and took an empty promise in return. It was a triumph for the Iroquois, who meant to keep their Indian captives, and did in fact keep nearly all of them. The chief objects of the late governor were gained. The power of the Iroquois was so far broken that they were never again very formidable to the French. Canada had confirmed her Indian alliances, and rebutted the English claim to sovereignty over the 5 tribes, with all the consequences that hung upon it. By the Treaty of Ryswick, the great questions at issue in America were left to the arbitrament of future wars; and meanwhile, as time went on, the policy of Frontenac developed and ripened. Detroit was occupied by the French, the passes of the West were guarded by forts, another New France grew up at the mouth of the Mississippi, and lines of military communication joined the Gulf of Mexico with the Gulf of St. Lawrence; while the colonies of England lay passive between the Alleghanies and the sea, till roused by the trumpet that sounded with wavering notes on many a bloody field, to peal at last in triumph from the heights of Abraham. End of chapters 20 and 21. End of France and England in North America, Part 5. Count Frontenac, New France, Louis XIV, by Francis Parkman, Jr. Recorded by Céline Major.